If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Skeptics and believers, what is the most true, chilling, paranormal and supernatural experiences have you encountered that made you believe? What my relatives saw at Halama Beach. Their story was always brought up when we would talk about our weird paranormal experiences. The dark figure they saw had always bothered them since they had no idea what it was, and it just felt so creepy. My two relatives were meeting others to camp at Halama Beach. They brought along their two older dogs and slept in their van. In the middle of the night, about 2 or 3 a.m., one of the dogs was having breathing difficulties. They left the campgrounds in a rush to find an emergency vet. On a small, deserted dirt road out of the area, they saw a person on a steep cliff staring out to the ocean ahead of them. This person was dressed in all black with a long hood covering their face, like the Grim Reaper, with a strange golden dog, or beast, to their side. When their car was approaching this figure, they saw it turn very slowly towards them in an almost mechanical and horror movie-like way. Another weird thing to note is that this figure was on the passenger's side with their backs towards the car facing the ocean. It should have turned to the right to face them but turned left, which was the longer way to turn your head and just added to the weirdness. They were both fixated on this figure and trying to see its face. They freaked out when their car approached it and saw there was no face in the hood but complete darkness. They both felt extremely scarred, and it always bothered them since it was so eerie and weird. They always wondered if they saw something similar to the Grim Reaper. It could be a dark watcher since it's near the area, wearing a dark hood or clothing, watching the ocean on a cliff, and turning to watch you, but the dog is throwing it off. Who knows? This experience happened to me overnight while camping about 3 miles down the mountain from the Appalachian Trail in southwest Massachusetts. We were well off the trail in a nice clearing, unfortunately located too close to a swamp, as we later discovered. The bugs were insane. We put out the fire and went to the tent well after dark, but it was a bit difficult to sleep. Neither of us could get comfortable. Then we heard the drums. They started off in the distance, seeming to come from up the mountain. At first, I thought it must be some people doing a drum circle or something, but then the drum noises started coming from equally distant places on the other side of us. They seemed to be circling the tent. We were both a bit spooked by it, but said nothing to each other in the moment. It felt like over an hour, but the drums kept circling us and getting closer. I don't remember if it stopped before I finally fell asleep. It was especially strange because we were so far off the trail that I would never have expected anyone to be near us. The drums were definitely foreboding, but I didn't feel in danger. Just incredible unease. I was visiting my family out of town this week at my mom's cabin, and on Monday I woke from a pretty solid sleep because I was feeling a bit queasy and uncomfortable. I was just lying there, looking up, feeling off. My body seemed chilled. I looked at the end of the bed, and there was a very prominent black figure just standing there, solid and unmoving. Then it slowly slid behind the wall. I felt sick for another 2 hours. On Tuesday, I was a bit anxious to go back to sleep, but I fell asleep fine. I didn't wake up. I had pleasant, unmemorable dreams. When I got out of bed, I got some coffee from my mom. And she said, "Wow. I slept great." She looked at me strangely and said I was yelling out loud in my sleep, "No. Go away. Leave me alone." She said she came in to see if I was okay, but I was just lying there sleeping. I didn't tell her about what I saw. I knew she would believe me. But when I was a little kid and I'd tell her I saw a ghost in my room, she would just say, "Yes, there is. Just pray, and they will go away." I didn't really want to hear her say that, and I can't get that image out of my head. I sage as soon as I flew home to make sure nothing clung to me. This is a true story that happened when I was 12 years old and my grandma's dog, Sasha, a sweet old corgi, had passed. My dad's side of the family is known to have experienced supernatural occurrences, a lot scarier than this story. I'm not much of a believer, but this was pretty real. The day my grandma cremated him and kept his ashes in an urn, my family and I were driving the 5 hours to her house. We all went to sleep when we arrived. I covered my body with blankets, as an eerie feeling had come over me and I couldn't sleep around midnight. Suddenly, I heard a click-clack in the hallway, sounding exactly like dog paws against a hardwood floor. I sat up, alert, but still hiding myself in the covers. I heard a howl echoing from downstairs, and the clacking continued, moving up and down the hallway and stopping at each bedroom door. I had my room door closed, and I was paralyzed in fear, as I knew something was out there. I didn't want to see what it was, either. I kept blinking and hoping my mind was playing tricks on me, but I was wide awake. This happened for 30 minutes or more. The next morning, I told my family what happened while at the breakfast table, and everyone dismissed it as my brother started freaking out like a baby. But once he left the room, my dad confirmed to me that he heard it too, and so did my grandmother. In fact, he heard the sound of Sasha's leash dragging on the wood floor as well. The house is old and settles in the night, but those sounds were very distinctive of an animal. The only animal that was ever there was Sasha, or at least he used to be there. Somewhere in my teenage years, I went to the Big Sur with my family, and we stayed in this log cabin type building. From the second we got there, it felt unexplainably eerie, as if we shouldn't be there. Then one of the first things the hotel owners told us was about some ghost myths in the area. We got into each other's heads about it over the course of the day, joking that the place was full of ghosts. I couldn't sleep. I was so scared. When I finally did manage to fall asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night and was drawn to a corner of the room. There was a figure sitting there, hunched over, inspecting a piano that was in the room. It was in the shape of a man but a vague blue light. I felt as though once I looked at it, its face, which had no clear features, began to turn around to look at me. At that point, I freaked out so bad that I hid under the sheets and prepared mentally for my possible demise. I was still full of fantasy at that age, probably super anxious and incredibly tired that night, and in a semi-dream state, but it all felt very convincing. The Big Sur has amazingly beautiful nature, but I don't think I'd go back just because of that one weird childhood experience. I'm from the era of the weekend, meaning loading up the station wagon and going for aimlessly long drives through the mountains. On one particular drive, we were coming down the hill at night, and there was a thickening smell of smoke. We were sure we were approaching a large forest fire. We passed a side road where my sister and I looked down the road and saw fire trucks, smoke, people running, and an orange glow. We both started yelling for my dad to stop and go back to see what was going on. He turned the car around, and when we got back to the road, there was nothing there but darkness. The weirdest part was that the smell of smoke was gone after being so strong before. I had an experience on Manitoulin Island, Ontario, years ago. Basically, at dusk, myself and my grandfather, liked going out along trails and fields to just watch the deer. They like hanging out in the fields. So we grabbed a pair of binoculars and set out. Eventually, we stop in a field, and we can see a few deer hanging out by the tree line. So we pulled out the binoculars and just looked at them. So as we're watching this doe, its head snaps over as if it noticed something, and then it bolts into the trees. After I lose sight, my grandfather pats me on the shoulder to get my attention and then whispers that there's a bear in the field. So as I lower the binoculars, he's pointing at this black shape roughly in the middle of the field. I took a quick look with the binoculars, but all I could make out was this pitch black shape that looked kind of weird. So we slowly start moving away. We don't want to get involved with a bear. As we start moving further, a good 50 to 100 meters away from where we were, we see this thing stand up, and it's just as you described. The sucker was tall, lanky, had thin, long arms, and was pitch black. I tried to take a look with the binoculars, but my grandfather just wanted to get the heck out of there. So he grabs my arm, and we start moving quicker. I saw this thing take off into the trees, and there was no mistaking that thing for a bear. The arms were just too long, and the thing was too thin on the bottom. That night I had dreams of this black thing crouching up in trees and chasing me down, but that's a dream. One afternoon, I was sitting and playing GoldenEye with a friend, 2001 or so. I was 20 at the time. I saw what I thought was a friend of his father's pull up on his motorcycle, not noticing that the motor wasn't making much noise. I was on a couch, and to the right of me was the door to the basement from the driveway, with one of those 9-pane windows in it. I saw someone, still thinking it was our friend, walk up to the door with a black hoodie on, and when he got close enough to look in, I glanced over. Suddenly, he ran off to the right, away from the window, as if frightened by seeing me. My friend said, "Did you see that?" And I said, "Yes." I was scared, thinking it was someone fixing to rob the house or whatever. With adrenaline on my side, I ran out the door and turned left where it would have gone. There was no one there or running away. There was a 10-foot tall wall of boulders there, which I then climbed and ran around the house looking for any signs. Since it was on a hill with few trees, I could see everywhere. Once we realized that if it was a person, he would have had to scale the 10-foot wall and run out of sight within 30 seconds, we were pretty freaked out. For days after that, his dog would bark at corners in rooms out of nowhere, which she had never done before or since. This experience completely opened my mind. It's hard to explain to people how it feels when your brain is trying so hard to categorize something and you just can't. This happened a long time ago. I think I was about 6 or 7 at the time. So I was just in my room, playing with toys or something, and it was almost time for bed. My mom usually came in after putting my brother to bed, so I was just waiting for her. My door was open wide. Suddenly, I saw a tall, dark silhouette of a human walking across the hall. I assumed it was my mom going to my brother's room, so I just kept on minding my business. But just about 30 seconds after I saw the silhouette go down the hall, I heard my brother's door open, and my mother stepped out into the hall. When she got to my room, I was confused and asked her if it was her that just walked down the hall. She said, "No, I've been in Jack's room for the last 10 minutes." She told me. That meant she couldn't have been in the hallway at the time I saw the silhouette. And I know people are going to say it was just a trick of the light or my 6-year-old imagination, but I don't think that was it. My mom saw things in my room when I was a baby, and they made her scared, and the things went away after praying about them. I'm religious and believe in the paranormal. In the moment, I wasn't scared or creeped out, I was just confused and wondering for an answer. But looking back on it years later, I still have no explanation for the figure in the hallway. I had always believed, but I never saw anything. Until I was 12. I was lying in my room, I have 2 dormers and a window in it, and I had my bed facing the far wall. I was putting up planets in my room and didn't have glue at the time, so I taped them up. I woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning, looked at the foot of my bed, I felt like my eyes were drawn to the foot, and floating at the end of my bed was a bluish, slightly transparent figure. He had burlap cut shorts, a white wife beater on, and a noose cut, and floating above his head around his neck, he had big black empty sockets where his eyes should have been. He was the blue and transparent version of the old Game Boy Advance, and his body figure looked like the blue guy from Nightmare Before Christmas. I remember sitting there thinking, "What is this?" And I said as calmly as I could, "Whoever you are, please leave me alone," and when I turned away, he had knocked Saturn, the planet picture, down. When I woke up at 8 o'clock, it was on the floor. To give context, this was on the night after Easter. The next year, my cousin hanged herself. The same night. I think he was a warning or something, but I have a definite idea and feel that he is still here. He just doesn't show himself as much, he just makes noises. Well, I grew up in a haunted house, so either seeing the old man in a trench coat disappear behind the boiler in the basement or the sliding closet door shaking violently and sliding back and forth for a solid 30 seconds were probably the top 2 incidents at that place. But the cream of the crop was outside of that house, and I had a random encounter at a family friend's place in Vermont on a ski trip when I was 13 to 14. I was staying on an air mattress in the living room, which, with the amount of space, was pressed up against the coffee table on my left side. Trying to fall asleep laying on my back, I had a beanie skull cap halfway covering my eyes, staring at the ceiling. I see a dark mass move super quickly past me on the left side, right where the air mattress and coffee table meet, like it ran past but didn't touch anything. Then I feel 2 hands press down on my chest and start to push me down. So hard that my back touched the floor through the air mattress, and the 2 sides folded up like a taco around me. Holds for a second or 2, and then just lets go, and the mattress snaps back and pops me up like lightly bouncing off a trampoline. I curled up under the sheet in a ball and didn't sleep the rest of the night. My family and I are kind of nuts about the weird and paranormal, so we're pretty much like magnets for this shit. Anyway, one night, about 2 years ago, at my parents' place, my siblings and I were sort of house watching. Well, 2 of them lived there to begin with, but I'd just like to hang out with my brother and sister, while my parents were visiting extended family for the weekend. Basically, it was a time to chill out, smoke a little, drink a little, and watch endless amounts of TV without the worry of parents. I like to smoke out on the backyard porch, partly because my parents have a beautiful property and partly because I didn't want to stink up the house. Since it was summertime, it was one of those perfectly warm nights where you didn't need to throw on a sweater after a couple of hours of darkness, so my boyfriend and I spent the majority of the evening sitting out there chatting about anything and everything. Since we were a little high, our conversations started to get really silly, and in the middle of discussing what we would personally do if earwigs and centipedes were the same size as humans, I absent-mindedly glanced over to one of the many trees in my parents' yard, and at first I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. But then the tree moved. No, it wasn't the tree, but something hanging from the tree. Luckily, we had the backlight on, and it flooded enough of the surrounding area, so I was able to make out the strange figure if I squinted my eyes hard enough. Whatever the hell it was, I realized that it was upside down. And when I noticed it, it slowly curled its body upward to grab onto a branch above. The speed at which it moved and how it moved reminded me almost of a sloth. In total length, it wouldn't have been bigger than 2 or 3 feet standing up, and I swear it appeared to be wearing some sort of clothing. From what I could see in the shadows of the tree, its skin was sort of a dull gray, and its eyes were softly glowing yellow, almost like when the light catches an animal's eyes in the dark. But it was a much more subtle version of that effect. I couldn't see the rest of the creature's facial features because the lower half seemed to be covered by some sort of scarf or headpiece, like a hood. Before I could get a better look, my "what the duck is that? Let's get the duck out of here" instincts kicked in, and my boyfriend had already noticed how tense and still I'd gotten, so all it took was a simple utterance of, "We need to go inside right now," for him to jump to his feet and rip open the patio door. Now, I've had a lot of strange things happen to me. Disembodied voices, seeing mist-like figures materialize in a camera's viewfinder right before my eyes, electronics acting up for absolutely no reason, full of apparitions, you name it. And while all of it has been creepy or mildly terrifying, this experience was hands down the most shocking I've ever had. As soon as we slammed the door behind us, locked it, and threw the blinds over it, I ran into the living room where my brother and sister had been and crumpled onto the floor in a panic attack. I ordered my sister to immediately start closing the drapes to cover all of the windows, and after managing to calm me down, I relayed what I'd seen, and my brother went out to check the tree with a flashlight himself. He's such a badass, although that's because he's also had some pretty horrifying experiences in his own time, but of course found nothing. I kept all the windows covered for the rest of the night, and now whenever I visit my family, I can't bring myself to look in even the general direction of that tree if I happen to be out after dark. If anyone has any ideas as to what it could have been, I'd be more than happy to hear them. My family and I are native Canadian, Ojibwe on my father's side, Mohawk on my mother's, so my brother thinks what I saw was probably what we know as a Pukka, which is basically a trickster sprite. They're known as mostly benevolent creatures, depending on which tribe you're talking to, but they can be dangerous, depending on whether or not they decide to play a trick on you and what sort of trick it is. One of my cousins encountered what he believed to be a Pukka, too, but unfortunately, his experience was slightly more terrifying than mine. My friend and I used to go cycling in the woods every weekend and in the summer when we were younger. The woodland near where I live is ancient and has a lot of history, especially with old ruinous manors from medieval times dotted around. We have so many happy memories from that period, but one really peculiar and scary evening stands out. One evening, we went deep into the woods and checked out this old abandoned farm where there were these huge pine trees in the center of the field. We had to hop a couple fences to reach these trees, and there was always something majestic about these isolated trees in a field. Anyway, when we left the field, it must have been around 6 o'clock, as it was still a crystal blue sky. I remember we both had this unbelievable sense of dread and panic that came over us, so we cycled off as fast as we could towards the exit, which was a tunnel into the back road. This was only a 5-minute cycle from the field with the isolated pine trees. However, my friend disappeared, and it felt like within a matter of minutes it was pitch black. I remember waiting at the entrance of the tunnel for my friend, as I was too scared to go through it alone, and it felt like I was waiting for hours. He turned up eventually, and he had no explanation as to where he had gone. Essentially, it felt as though 2 to 3 hours had been compressed into 5 minutes, and daylight turned to dusk with a flick of a switch. To this day, I have no explanation as to what the sensation we felt was or how time seemed to warp. Those woods have always had an eerie and mystical feel about them. I used to have difficulty sleeping and could lay awake for hours. I'd let my eyes adjust to the dark. There was a street lamp about 15 feet from my window. Any gap in the curtains was enough to see the room. I was used to seeing the lights from passing cars travel across my walls and ceiling. My bedroom was upstairs. However, this one night I was just lying there when I noticed a light in the corner of the room start to move. My first thought was car headlights again, but I quickly realized it wasn't moving along the wall. Instead of the usual 2 streaks of light from the thin gap in the curtain, it was the shape of a man, and it wasn't on the wall but seemed to be actually in the room. It had a greenish glow and looked almost like you would imagine something like a hologram being projected in the room, but without any details, just the shape. It walked across the foot of my bed and towards the door, then was gone. I remember not being scared, I was just a little confused. I thought about it for a while, running through the possible explanations, before deciding to try and sleep again. We never considered the house to be haunted in any way, although after I moved out when I was 18, my parents have claimed to have started frequently hearing someone opening the front door and running up the stairs but never finding anyone when my dad goes to check, amongst other strange things, and I had never seen anything like it before and since, other than what appeared to be a small ball of light above my brother's cot one night when he was a baby. I'm a 19-year-old Nigerian girl. I've had my share of experiencing paranormal stuff, but there is one in particular that still scares me to this very day. It happened when I was around 7 or 8. I shared a room with my siblings, my 2 brothers and my sister. One night, I got up to pee when I heard a very ominous sound. It sounded like a hum. I froze. I was looking down because I still felt sleepy, but as I heard the sound, I raised my head, and what I saw made me freeze in fear. Standing directly in front of me was a man with a dark figure. He had horns on his head, and his eyes were black. He looked at me and began to chant something. As he called my name, I felt myself being pulled toward him. I was so petrified, I couldn't scream. Somehow I managed to scream "Mom," and I ran to my parents' room. Hearing my screams, they woke up in alarm and asked me what was wrong. When I told them what happened, they panicked and ran to the room my siblings were in. The malevolent entity was gone. I know I've seen the devil in most of my nightmares, but I still am petrified about how he appeared to me at a very young age. I just hope I don't have to relive that horrific experience ever again. I got a new job and started cycling past an old person's care home on the way. I work shifts. One morning I was cycling to work at about 4:30 a.m., and as I passed the long driveway that leads up from the road to the care home, which is a large building that looks like a pre-war stately home or something similar, sprawling grounds, etc., I almost collided with another cyclist that was coming down the driveway. I only saw them at the last second, just a flash of a blue jacket and the vague shape of a person on a bike. After damn near shitting myself, I had to look around but couldn't see the other person anywhere. I shrugged it off and kept going. After that, I always kept an eye out for cyclists coming down that driveway. 6 weeks or so after the first incident, I saw the same cyclist coming towards me. I got a better look this time. A woman in her late 50s or early 60s with a slim build and light blue fleece is wearing a black helmet on a black bicycle. I stopped to allow her to pass me. She never did. There's a big gateway where the drive meets the road. She disappeared from view behind the gateway and never came out on the other side. I've seen her several times since then, always in the same place around the same time. She never makes it out of the driveway. She always disappears where the road starts. It's a poorly lit road with a relatively high speed limit, so I feel it's fairly obvious what may have happened. I don't know if it's real or if I'm crazy, but considering I've never, to my knowledge, been prone to any sort of hallucination under any other circumstance, I'm willing to entertain the possibility that I see a ghost every now and then. I'd like to ask other people in my area if they've seen anything like that, but I don't want to come across as a lunatic, so I've kept this largely to myself, only telling my wife and posting about it under a pseudonym on the interwebs. I've experienced many other things that are individually less convincing but, when taken all together, are somewhat persuasive to me. Opening my mind to the possibility that paranormal or occult things exist has allowed me to make sense of a few life experiences from when I was younger. You might think I'm mad. You might be right. 2 years ago, I'd have rolled my eyes in a big way if someone professed the beliefs I now hold, albeit with a loose grip. I do believe in the paranormal and the unknown. Whether you do or not is your personal choice. I'm all for people having their own beliefs. So to understand the story, you need to understand the layout of the house. It's a 3-story house. The first floor is a basement. The second floor is the kitchen/living room. On the third floor are the bedrooms and a bathroom. From the front door, which is where the living room is, you can see up the stairs to the third floor. The hallway is slanted, so in your view from this angle, you can see the bathroom, but you cannot see inside. This is the first thing you would discover if you were to walk up the stairs. Then you can see into the first bedroom, and the other two are blocked off from view due to the slant. Anyway, this story took place when I was 6 years old. I don't remember too much since I was so young. I remember I was in the living room by the front door with my father, grandma, and grandpa. I don't remember why we were standing there. I think I just came back in from playing outside. I'm standing there, looking up the stairs into the hallway. Then all of a sudden I see this shadow, just a black mass of a shadow shaped into a person. It walks into the bathroom. I remember pointing in that direction and asking why a man just went into the bathroom. Everyone was just kind of confused and in shock. I don't remember if someone went to check or not, but I was told there was no man in the bathroom. Mind you, the bathroom light was off. There was no possible way this was a reflection. Being 6 years old, I can't remember my emotions. I don't really think I was scared, I was just confused. Since I grew up, I've had time to learn things, and I really think what I saw that night was a shadow person. For anyone who doesn't know what a shadow person is, they're a perception of a human. They're a black mass, aka shadow, that takes on the shape of a person. There's no feature. No face, no hair, no anything. They're just a shadow in the shape of a human. I actually think the one I saw looked like it was wearing a top hat. I said man because you definitely couldn't tell the gender of a shadow person. Whether you think this was my childhood imagination or a supernatural occurrence, I know what I saw. I haven't forgotten it, even years later. It's one of my earliest memories of life. This was my first, and definitely not my last, time seeing a shadow person. It's actually said that shadow people are harmless and are actually rumored to protect you. Whether you think shadow people aren't real or there's something supernatural. Whether you think they're a harmless spirit or something much deeper, regardless of how you perceive them, they cannot be explained. Reserves are strange places, man. Okay, so I've only ever been to one, but still. I lived on the res one summer when I was 13. There were me and my 2 cousins, who were under 10 years old at the time. We were outside, I was gathering little pieces of dried wood, and the 2 younger ones were playing in front of our house. I looked over at the path that was between our house and the next, and there was a man in a trench coat with a black fedora walking along that path. I couldn't see his face because the hat shaded it. My grandma took one look at him, and then she hurried us inside, locked the door, and told me to lock the other. This incident stuck out in my mind because that guy looked into every window. He didn't knock on the door or say anything at all. He just peeked into our windows and left. It was bloody hot out, yet he had on a large black trench coat. It was so weird. I'm a huge believer in the paranormal. Always have been. Since I was young, I've had a few run-ins with paranormal experiences, ghosts, Ouija boards, energies, stuff like that. I like to take a scientific approach to it, but sometimes things are just beyond rational explanation. My favorite go-to story I like to tell happened a few years ago. My college girlfriend and I were home for summer break, and we decided one night to go camping. In reality, my house was set on a hill, and the yard sloped down into a huge field, ending with a river. With its own fire pit, it made for a great camping spot, hence the air quotes. We had done this a few times, and tonight was no different. Packing the truck with a tent and blankets, wine, snacks, and some fire starter, we drove down to the river. You could see the house from the spot, and it sat like a beacon with the lights on, so we were never really too far from home, just in case it was too cold or something. We set up, started the fire, swam in the river, and had dinner. I eventually popped open a bottle of wine and just talked for a while. Before long, night fell, and it was pitch black. Maybe around 9 o'clock at night. I had had a few pulls of wine but was mostly sober as we had drank heavily the night before, and I just needed a little buzz to kill any residual hangover. This is important. So we're just chilling, and then, from across the river, maybe 30 feet from bank to bank, we see these orbs of light walking through the forest on the other side. No big deal, probably just some campers themselves. We watched them for a while, and I wasn't sure why my hair stood up on end until I thought about it. There were 12 lights, perfectly round white orbs. Flashlights leave a trail of light, not a solid orb. What's more is that they seem to move in an almost uniform fashion, as if in formation. My girlfriend started to ask about their movement too, because she couldn't figure it out either. It just looked strange. There were also whispers across the lake. It sounded like Boy Scouts or young teenagers. That's what we thought they were. But these orbs moved through the trees so perfectly, not bobbing like flashlights, that I knew something wasn't right. And that's when it hit me. There was nothing across the lake, as in, there's no solid land. Just marsh. For lights to be moving like that, even from a lantern, they would be stumbling and falling from the steps in the mud. But they weren't. Hello? I called out. Are you guys scouts? Hello? Nothing. I called again. By this point, my girlfriend was already putting out the fire with buckets of water from the river. I didn't notice. Hello? I called again, almost jokingly. The lights stopped. And then they began to move out of the trees and float across the river. Disembodied, we bolted into the truck, and I floored it up the hill. By the time we had run onto the porch and looked out at the campsite, the orbs were floating around the, now extinguished, fire in our tent until they disappeared into thin air. You can say what you will, but along with a multitude of other experiences at that house specifically, I do believe something paranormal occurred that night. This happened a few years ago on a camping trip, but it feels like yesterday. Me and my friend, both teen girls at the time, were sleeping a few yards from her aunt's trailer in a little tent. After goofing off for a while, we settled down. I faced one side of the tent, and she faced the other. I was just starting to fall asleep when I could tell a bright light was illuminating the tent. You know how you can tell the lights are on even when your eyes are closed? Assuming it was a car or something of the sort driving by, I kept trying to sleep. I heard an odd scratching sound as well, but didn't think much about it. I felt my friend tap my shoulder, but for some reason I thought she had just rolled over while sleeping and had done it by accident. Finally, after another tap to the shoulder, I slowly and quietly turned to face her side of the tent. There was an incredibly bright light, brighter than any flashlight I've seen, pointing straight at the tent. There was only one point of light, so it couldn't have been a car. The best comparison I could draw is a motorcycle, but we would have heard a motorcycle approach the tent, or any vehicle for that matter. This wasn't the scary part, though. It looked as though some kind of hooked saw-like object was being dragged slowly against the fabric of the tent and made very visible by the abrasive light, but we could not see anything holding it up. Then the light just switched off, and we didn't hear or see anything else that night. When we worked up the courage to book it the few yards to the trailer her aunt was in, we didn't see anyone or anything out of place outside. After we got inside, she told me that before I had turned around to look at whatever she had seen, multiple shapes similar to the weird hooked saw thing were very clearly dragged against the tent, still with nothing seeming to hold them up. All equally terrifying and sharp looking, but nothing like I'd ever seen. It looked like the contents of a toolbox from hell. Not exactly the most terrifying, but it absolutely rattled me to my core, and I still cannot explain it. Let me start by saying I come from a deeply religious family where we never spoke about the paranormal. That being said, I've had many different experiences in my life that cannot be explained. Before my husband and I moved, we were in a newer townhouse, and we were only the second or third tenants. There were several times I saw different things or even experienced voices. My stepson would even tell us that his friend Charlie came to visit at night. One night, when it was just my husband and me home, we were together talking in bed. I started to hear a quiet whistle, like a song. I had asked my husband if he could hear it, but he had suggested it was just the wind. About 5 minutes later, we had continued our conversation, and I had a blinding pain in my head come out of nowhere. At that moment, my husband heard the whistling. We both stopped and looked at each other. Only for the whistling to stop and the sound of footsteps pounding up our hallway stairs. My husband ran outside our bedroom, there was nobody there, and my sudden headache went away. Normally, I would think it was a nightmare, but both my husband and I had heard the whistling, the footsteps, and then the pain. When my mother heard about what happened a few weeks later during a family dinner, she pulled me aside and let me know that I needed to be careful because I had always been sensitive to the other side. Needless to say, this specific experience has always stuck with me. I was at my aunt's house in Vancouver. I went downstairs to go to the bathroom. After washing my hands, I head down the hall to go up the stairs, but I hear someone. So I quickly bolted back to the bathroom. I can see through the crack in the door. The little gap where the hinges are, I see them walk by casually. So I turn the corner, and they're gone. I searched all the rooms, but no one. What the duck? I head upstairs, making sure no ducker is going to pop up behind me. I head up and ask who just went down the stairs. They were just discussing my grandma's death. She died in the house in her sleep. I didn't know her at all, and they all say that I probably saw her. It still ducks with me every time. Like, what if I said, boo, through the door? Would they have just kept on walking or turned around? Dear God. When I was younger, I had this Disney Pocahontas doll that was in a case with a motion sensor light. We always had the button for it turned off since it sat on a high shelf that I couldn't reach. Every night, that light would turn on for a solid minute before turning off again, but when we checked the case, we found that the batteries in said case were actually dead. Years later, when I started high school and got my license, I would be going to school or out with friends, and my family would hear me screaming for them. They would look for me, thinking I had come home, but in reality, I was still out. I would often receive frantic calls asking if I was okay. This would continue on well into my adult life. We all hear each other's voices, even when they're not around. I still live in the house and have made peace with the strange occurrences. My neighbor owns a pig, a horse, and an old mule, which frequently break down their pen and roam the holler. My father-in-law lives about a quarter mile or more around a heavily forested hill from our home in a very rural area of Lincoln County, West Virginia. One night, I was walking to his house. I didn't have a flashlight because the moon was full and it wasn't too foggy. When I passed by the pear tree, which marks the halfway point, all the hair on my body stood up, and I broke out in the worst goosebumps I've ever had. I couldn't quite place what was wrong until I heard an awful screech followed by the brush cracking, and all three of the neighboring animals came barreling past me, eyes rolled up until all you could see were the whites, which is terrifying enough because I immediately thought bear. Followed by the scariest thing I've ever seen. Its body was at least 6 feet tall, and it was gliding on 2 legs. The front side looked all twisted and broken, with a mangled head full of rotten fur, sharp teeth, and glowing red eyes, and the back was raw and glistened pink in spots where muscle showed through. After it passed by, I could smell rotten eggs and death. Y'all, I swear it looked right at me and hissed or cackled, then continued to chase the animals down the hill. I screamed and ran for my father-in-law. He met me at the door, and while I told him what was out there, he loaded the shotgun and went to go after it. Suddenly, from over the hillside, we could hear the old mule screaming, and then everything went dead silent. At this point, we just nodded back inside. The next day, we went looking for the old mule and found it eviscerated with pieces strung all around, about 1,000 feet from where the pear tree stands. The pig had a large gash down its side but was otherwise fine, as was the horse. Now we've heard this thing a couple of times after this but only seen its eyes glowing in the woods. It makes me shudder just to write this, and needless to say, I don't walk alone or unarmed anymore. I'm not sure if this thing was a ghost, demon, or creature, but it was definitely one of my scariest experiences. I was born and raised in Agawam, Massachusetts. However, when I was around 5 or 6, we moved to Hampton, Virginia. My mom hated it there, and we moved back after a year. We had lived in the projects before we moved, so she had a hard time finding us a place to live. However, her mom and dad pulled some strings and got the old man Jenkins of their street, Mr. James, to rent us the shack on Cosgrove Avenue. I was only 7, but there weren't any kids my age, so I had to make friends with the teenagers. I don't know why they actually wanted to hang out with me. It must have been like babysitting, especially because of my ADHD back then. They did, though. They told me all the neighborhood legends of the giant Rottweiler in the junkyard and all that garbage. One stuck out for me, though, probably because I lived there. This was the legend of the haunted shack. Mikey B was about 13 at the time. He and Audrey got together and told me about the shack. Let me describe it to you. This shack was a rickety shithole. The walls were sided with roofing shingles, and the roof was slate. It literally looked like it was falling apart. The windows were as old as the house, and looking into, or out of, them felt like staring into an abandoned house. Even with the slight renovations we did, the place was not worth what we were paying. Unfortunately, James was the only guy who would rent to us back then, so we had to settle. Apparently, the house was in James' family for generations. It had to be over 100 years old, and it was definitely the first house on the street besides James. Mikey told me a few stories of before we moved in, when the place had been abandoned for years. James was Mikey's great-grandfather, so he stole the keys to the shack and brought the neighborhood kids in with him. Through the front door, the 50s tile floor and the pale yellow walls of the kitchen immediately threw off an eerie feeling. They avoided the basement to their left and went into the empty living room. Every step creaked. Unfortunately, I can confirm this, and it was just the kind of place they didn't want to be. Audrey dared everyone to go upstairs to the second floor. Mikey was the youngest, but he tried to be the toughest, and he went first. The first bedroom on his left became my bedroom. It was the one in the most disrepair. There were holes in the walls and carpet, and the closet door didn't shut. He thought he saw something in the closet, but he didn't dwell on it. I'm drawing this out too much. Even though the upstairs looked creepy as hell, nothing happened. Disappointed, the teenagers went back downstairs. Mikey was still in front, and as soon as he hit the bottom step, they heard a howl. Cosgrove was near the woods and known for wild coyotes, and since it was evening, they decided they should get home. Walking into the kitchen, they heard what sounded like a whimper from the basement. They looked at each other, perplexed, but that didn't last long before they heard loud, intermittent bangs coming from the basement. They busted out the front door, Mikey locked it, and then they ran away. Mikey looked back, and he swore to his mother that in the rickety old front window into the living room, he saw a girl with long black hair and pale skin, smiling a toothy grin at him. Please. I've seen The Ring before. Even at 7 years old, I thought that was total bullshit. Also, being 7, I was still scared shitless of my house at this point. Over time, I heard a lot of noises in the shack. Noises that sounded so deliberate, even though everyone was asleep or nobody was home. My mom said it was the house settling. She's never really humored the idea of the paranormal. When I was in bed, I'd see weird stuff happening. There were shadows on the wall and ceiling that shouldn't have been there. Only one lamp was on, so I checked the lampshade and light bulb, but nothing was obstructing the light. I would see my closet door creak slightly open more and more. If anything creepy happened in that house, it was definitely in my bedroom. It just gave off that vibe. I'd see my action figures' heads turn completely toward me, only to be back where they were as soon as I blink. I was always scared of that damned room and that damned creaky, dark hallway outside of the door that stood open a foot away from my head. It was an uncomfortable place to live. It's been 10 years, and this still haunts me today. I was lying in bed, hiding from the turning heads and shadows and closet doors and nonsense. I was under my covers. I had grown accustomed to sleeping that way. I heard a whisper. It was my mom. William? I was curious as to what she wanted, so I turned over and looked. I'm getting chills down my spine writing this. I haven't forced myself to remember so much about this place in a long time. Sorry for going on a tangent. Anyway, I turn over and look, and I swear to you, this is what I saw. Completely illuminated by my lamp, I saw her, or it. I don't know. It looked like a woman with shoulder-length, ratty black hair, covering a part of her face. Her clothes were tattered so badly that she was nearly half naked. Her pale, green skin screamed decay. I stared in terror, and she stared with her one visible, yellowed eye. She broke her silence and said in my mother's voice, "Hi, sweetie." As she finished the statement, the voice became grave and dead. She then giggled and smiled that sinister, toothy grin. I can remember this moment like a ducking photo. Then I hid and screamed. I screamed bloody murder and bawled until my mother came to comfort me. But I screamed at her too, because she sounded just like that thing. She pulled me out and held me until I calmed down. I was so afraid to sleep the rest of the night in that room, but I did. Nothing like that ever happened again. I want to believe that apparition was just a nightmare or hallucination, but at that age, I didn't know what decay looked like. I didn't know what a half-naked woman looked like. However, she resembled all of those traits. The ambient noises in the shack still remained, but I never saw the girl again. It stayed with me like a picture for 10 years now. Even as I forced myself to remember and type this, my mom came in and said something, and I jumped farther than I've jumped in a long time. This happened when I was 16. My buddies and I back in high school would hold LAN parties at my buddy's house. We all played from Friday night to Sunday morning. My buddy's mom, a single mom, would leave every weekend to do whatever she would do, and we'd be left with pizza money and the house, really. Anyways, we'd all stay up really late, sometimes all night just gaming. With my buddy's mom always gone, we felt obligated to do the dishes and help with messes and whatnot around the house. Let me preface this part. My buddy lived in a very old town in California, San Juan Bautista, if you're interested in learning about its history. It's really cool, honestly. It goes back through the Camino, which is a real road. Anyway, the graveyard had to be relocated due to the town growing and being so old that the town had to move the bodies and the cemetery across the street to a major hill. My buddy lived across the street from the current graveyard, exactly where the old cemetery used to be. Ironically, the lot next to his house couldn't be built on because the town wasn't able to move everyone. So back to the experience. My buddy and I are doing dishes around 2 a.m. To the left of the kitchen, around the corner, was a dead end, the laundry room. To the right of us was the dining room, and across from the dining room was the living room. Splitting the rooms was the hallway leading to the rooms towards the back of the house. So my buddy and I hear a growling sound from the laundry room and decide it's time to buckle it up and head back to the room. We start to head towards the hallway, and on our right, in the living room, is the same growl, but louder. Absolute chicken skin. And we started to run to the room. We made it all right, but we were definitely spooked. My buddy would hear scratching and running up and down the hallway. He even slept with his upper torso in his closet, took the doors off, placed a blanket covering the view to his room, and would sleep behind that veil to not see anything. Wicked house and wild story. My dad is a nurse who works at a nursing home in a small town in the south of the Netherlands. I respect nurses a lot because you need a great deal of patience and have to be able to handle difficult situations, like someone with dementia wandering off and bringing him or her back safe and sound. My dad had just started his night shift one night when he got a call from an elderly man, whom I will refer to as William. William shared a 2-person bedroom with another man, whom we'll call Charles. These 2 men were mentally healthy and had no signs of dementia whatsoever. This will be important to the story later. So my dad walks over to the 2-person room and asks William if everything is okay and if he needs help with something. William said, "There was a man in my room just now. He stood next to my bed, was wearing a long trench coat, and had a top hat on his head. And he had this very large book under his arms." I didn't dare say anything to him. My dad looked confused and asked, "Maybe it was Charles you saw who got up to use the restroom?" William responded, "I did not make out his face, but I'm sure it wasn't Charles, because I checked and he was asleep when the man stood next to me." My father was pretty shocked to hear this and offered William to wait next to him until he fell back asleep. When William did, my dad checked on Charles, who was still sound asleep. Halfway through the night, my dad's shift ended, and a coworker took over for him. He told her about the sighting of the man in the room. She didn't really believe him very much, though. The next day, in the afternoon, my dad had to go to work again. When he arrived, the coworker told him what appeared to have gone down last night. The coworker did not receive any more calls from the 2-person bedroom. The next morning, as the coworker was making her usual round to wake everyone, she discovered Charles lying lifeless on his bed. She asked other coworkers to come help her, to maybe save his life, but they noticed he was already cold to the touch. When they asked William about it, who had been woken up by all the commotion and was now sitting completely baffled on the edge of his bed, he gave them an answer that left them confused and frightened. He woke up out of nowhere, in the middle of the night, when he saw that the strange man had returned. This time, William did say something. He asked, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Unlike last time, the man spoke. In a deep, low voice, he responded, "I'm not here for you, I'm here for your neighbor. Go back to sleep, William." William was too scared to say or do anything after this. He shut his eyes and tried to fall back to sleep, which, miraculously, he did. Later, the staff reviewed the security footage of the hallway in which the entrance to William's room was. No one, except for my dad, got in and out of that room the previous night. William still believes to this day that the man who visited them that night was a physical manifestation of death. This happened when I was about 8 or 9 years old. Growing up, I spent the majority of my time with my grandmother. My father, uncle, and, of course, my grandfather all lived in the same house as my grandmother. Because of this, I was used to my uncle and dad being around. I was an only child, so my uncle and father spent a lot of time playing jokes on me. One night, I was lying on my grandma's bed, talking to her about God knows what nonsense. The way I was lying was sort of particular, in that I was facing her, but one of my arms was positioned behind my back. I remember her asking me if I was really comfortable like that. It was an odd position, I must admit, however, at the time, I found it somehow comfortable. Anyway, during our conversation, I spotted a pair of hands on the tiled floor. It looked as though they were crawling. I only saw this in my peripheral vision, so I did not have a great view. However, I immediately figured it must be my dad or uncle trying to spook me. So I played it cool, thinking I'd surprise them as soon as they were behind me. I kept my conversation going with my grandma as if I did not suspect a thing, and the next thing you know, someone was grabbing the hand I had so oddly placed behind my back and pulling me down. I laughed and turned my head, expecting to see my father or uncle, only to be met with nothing. This thing had me in an insanely tight grip. So much that I could not fully turn around. It pulled me harder, and I screamed at my grandma to pull me back up onto the bed. She grabbed my hand and pulled me back as I heard my uncle and father coming through the front door, assumingly alarmed by my screaming. When the thing finally let up, I spun around, only to see the two hands receding under the bed. I was flipping out, crying, and screaming for my father to check under the bed for whatever grabbed me. My grandma was a bit of a pack rat, so she kept all sorts of memorabilia, boxes, pictures, etc., under her bed for safekeeping. There was no way anyone could fit under the bed. Needless to say, my dad and uncle searched the entire house only to find nothing. My uncle and father were on the front porch when it happened and saw nothing outside, and my grandfather was sitting in the living room, where both entries to the house were visible. All the windows were still locked too. Understandably, the grandmother was convinced that she just got wrapped up in the blankets and started to fall. But that, unfortunately, does not explain the hands I saw. To this day, I have no explanation as to what that was or what would have happened if those hands managed to pull me away from my grandmother. I live on some property in Wilson, Oklahoma. Wilson and some of the surrounding towns are known to have a sort of hallowed grounds existence to them, and we all know you can't have the good without the bad. Now I'm not sure if everyone here fully believes in the paranormal or that there are things out there we haven't fully discovered or understood, but I do, and have, long before I moved to where I live now. I've had paranormal things happen my whole life, and it's not like when I moved here everything just started going crazy. Don't get me wrong. When I moved here, I had heard the stories, knew about Molly and Colt, and had heard of cryptids, skinwalkers, etc., but other than seeing shadows or the occasional flying deodorant can, I never really came across anything that scared me. That was until about 2 years after I moved here. I had just left my shop on the property and was walking my dog over to my house. Now I don't know what gave me this intuition, but I've always kind of had a sixth sense, so to speak. Not like I feel like I'm being watched, but more like something's just not right about this. I put my dog in my house because I don't want her to get hurt. She's a 107-pound yellow lab, so she's not in any real danger, but I do everything I can to keep her safe, anyway. I shut the door and walked around the side of my house. Now there's an AC unit with a wall close to it on 2 of the sides, and something tells me to go check the corner I can't see. So without hesitation, I trot over to the AC unit, peek over to the corner, and use my phone flashlight to see if anything was there, and honestly, what I saw kind of perplexed me at the time, but now thinking about it, it kind of gives me the chills. Illuminated under my light is an armadillo. But it's not normal, I swear to you, this armadillo had no tail. Not like it had been bitten off, like if it had not fully grown. I can't fully see its head and face, which, again, looking back is kind of weird because, from the angle I was looking at, I should have been able to. I'm looking directly over it. I'm looking over this armadillo for a second because it just looks so weird. I see its eye, just one eye looking at me, and it's like it knew that I knew something, but I just hadn't connected the dots yet. I walk inside, and no sooner than I shut the door did all the dots connect. No tail, weird shape, a weaker small animal, no face I can see, but I can look it in the eye. Skinwalker. Now keep in mind that I'm from Texas and live in Oklahoma. I grab my Glock 19 and real flashlight from the cabinet they're in and run back to the corner. It's gone completely. There is nowhere to be found. Keep in mind that this is a 5,000 lumen Bushnell hunting flashlight specifically made for this. The thing disappeared. The craziest thing is, 2 days later, my dad sent me a picture while I'm at work of the most beat up looking, rabid looking, tailless, coyote. From what I hear, skinwalkers are smart. Not immortal. If you think you have a skinwalker problem, keep your protection close. You may need it. I swear it's all true, and I'm not too scared about it either. I had several experiences in an apartment I used to live in. There is only one I remember vividly. I was lying in bed, it was completely dark. There was a double-door closet with wooden slanted blinds. I'm not sure how to describe them, but you could see into the closet at the right angle with the right lighting. I see through my eyelids that a light is going on in the room. Open my eyes, the light is on in the closet, and the doors are closed. I see a dark silhouette of a person, and I assume it is my then boyfriend messing with me. I call out, asking what he is doing. The light then turns off in the closet, no light switch on the outside. There was a string hanging from the light itself, and I hear X say, "What are you talking about?" From the living room. After calming down and explaining what happened to him, we went to look, and of course no one was there. I have no idea what it was to this day for sure, but I hope it was paranormal. This happened at one of my ex-boyfriend's houses. So the house was in front of a wooded area. I wouldn't call it a forest because it wasn't that thick. Anyway, I always felt super freaked out walking into his house. I mean, all the time, I would run full force. It always felt like someone was watching you, and it was just this super uncomfortable feeling. I would feel it even if I was floating in the pool during the day. One night, me, my boyfriend, his brother, and his girlfriend were all out on the deck having a drink and sitting by the fire. There was a visible light back there, it looked like a flashlight. It was so beyond weird that the boys obviously went to check it out and found nothing. There were a couple experiences I had in the house. So one night I go downstairs to use the bathroom and grab a drink of water. As I'm walking back through the living room, I stop dead in my tracks. There was something standing right in front of me. It was this big black shadow. I literally reached my hands out, thinking I was going to walk into something. I couldn't see anything through whatever this was, but I could see the outlines of the other things in the room. I got so cold. And so scared, I ran so fast up those stairs. Another time we were laying in bed, and we heard what sounded like something running across the room to the side of his bed. He grabbed it so tight, and we turned on every single light. This thing literally ran across the room to the side of the bed. This other story happened when I was sitting at his stepmother's house. So his stepbrothers grew up in this same house, and they have a ton of stories. Mine isn't that crazy, but it still freaked me out. So as I was getting ready in the bathroom, there was a big staircase that was right in front of the bathroom. Their dog was lying on top of those stairs. As I'm getting ready, I hear the sound of her tail wagging, like hitting the floor, so I peek out the bathroom, and I see her laying there with her eyes open, wagging her tail as if someone were walking up the stairs. I ran and locked myself in the bedroom, and I made him leave work to come and get me. When I was about 13, my dog died. His name was Rocco, and he was just the best. It was really strange, too, because we couldn't figure out how he died. The day he died, my stepdad tied him up in our backyard before he and my mom left for work and my brothers and I left for school. When we all got home after, he was just lying there like he was sleeping, but he was really stiff and cold. There weren't any scratches or marks on him or anything. Later on, we kind of figured that our next door neighbor might have poisoned him. My dad dug a hole in a far corner of our backyard, and we buried him that night. My mom put this little garden statue of a dog on top. Anyway, so my mom used to have me hang clothes on our clothesline to save money, but sometimes she would have me do it at night, and I would always get scared. My backyard is pretty long, and the very back has these big, bushy, low trees right behind where we buried my dog. I swear, it was terrifying at night. So, One night, maybe 3 days after Rocco died, I was still extremely upset about it. My mom had me go out and hang up some clothes to dry. I step out onto the back porch, and I look out at the back trees to make sure I don't see anything. I see Rocco sitting there in front of the trees, wagging his tail with his mouth hanging open and panting, really excited to see me. I smiled, walked over to the clothesline, and started hanging. I start singing Rocco, ro-o-o-o-oo and whistling, and I think, I'll go over and pet him when I'm done. And then, all of a sudden, I realized that he died 3 days ago. I swear, my skin got goosebumps all over. I looked over to the little spot where we buried him, and I could just make out the little statue of a dog. I was really scared because I could swear on my life that he was just standing right there, all excited that someone was outside. It was just so normal to see him out there when I would go outside at night that when I saw him, I didn't even think twice. After that, I ran inside and refused to finish, and I felt so dumb that I didn't tell my parents. According to both my parents and grandparents, there was a ghost that moved from house to house with them. By the time I came along, they were used to its disturbances, phantom footsteps, doors opening and closing on their own, a vase of flowers that constantly refused to stay on the piano they had, and one sighting by my grandmother of a gray figure standing in the living room. This is some of what they told me. My mom divorced my biological father very soon after I was born, and she and I lived with my grandparents during the first few years of my life. When I began speaking and walking on my own, they said I would tell them that I was going to go play with the man who lived upstairs. They apparently never stopped me from doing so, either due to assuming I had an imaginary friend or that whatever this entity in the house was, it heretofore seemed harmless. When Mom started seeing the man who I consider my father, we continued staying with my grandparents until he got his bearings and could save up some money. He had just gotten out of the Marines, having entered at the tail end of Vietnam and serving most of his stint in the Philippines. One night, he was staying with us and was going to sleep in the spare bedroom. Now, this bedroom was where I went during my visits with the man upstairs and wasn't exactly a place where the rest of the family liked to hang out. Dad decided he was going to stay there and scoffed when both Mom and my grandparents told him that our Pukka, that's what they called it, stayed there. Cut to later that night. Mom and I are sleeping in the bedroom down the hall, and Dad wakes us up. Apparently, he can't sleep in that room because he swears someone is watching him. Now, Dad is a hard guy. He did some things he still doesn't talk about. He doesn't scare easily. The fact that he simply refused to go back into that room says a lot. The Pukka ended up leaving, I guess. This is how it happened, according to Granddad. He and his grandmother were in bed, and he was woken up by her talking in her sleep. She sat up in bed, still asleep, and said, "In the name of Jesus, get out of this house." Granddad heard the kitchen door leading outside open and close. He grabbed his pistol, he has always kept a loaded pistol on his nightstand, and ran downstairs. The kitchen door was locked, but he either heard or saw through the little windows that the screen door was slowly swinging shut. After that, there were no more disturbances. Now, I don't believe that the spirits of the dead roam the earth. However, the stories my family has told me over the years have never changed. Not one bit. I'm planning on recording my granddad talking about this, and maybe Dad if he'll let me. I know this isn't a flashy story, but I've always found it interesting that whatever it was stayed with them for so many years and left the way it did. I've only had one other experience in my life, equally vague, but it still gives me chills thinking about myself as a little kid playing with a ghost. I've been experiencing paranormal things ever since I was a kid. One of the earliest occurrences that comes to mind is the time I was sleeping over at my friend's house when I was probably around 8 years old. Her aunt had just died, she was very old and had been bedridden for a long time. We were watching Titanic on my friend's TV when all of a sudden the lights in the room went completely out, and a strong gust went past our faces and knocked down a plate that was for decoration on a high shelf. Then the lights went on again, and needless to say, we were freaked out. When I was around 9, my little brother and I were sitting on the couch watching TV. Around the TV, my mom has a collection of ceramic angels on the shelves. I watched as a ceramic angel was lifted off a shelf and held to the ceiling face down. At a really fast speed, the angel was dropped and shattered everywhere. I still get the chills thinking about that. I've had a number of absolutely terrifying experiences involving sleep paralysis. I know there's a lot of debate about sleep paralysis regarding whether or not it's the mind or something that's actually paranormal happening, but I firmly believe that I was visited by an evil presence, among other things that have annoyed and scared the shit out of me while I was trying to sleep. A few times out of the year, my family and I will see shadows walking around for a few days out of the corners of our eyes, then they stop showing up. I'm not sure who they were, but we were never threatened. On my 16th birthday, I lost my dear cat, Mr. Spock." Months later, the family and I would hear him pawing at the garage door and meowing his very distinct meow that almost sounded like hello. There was a time when I was probably 10 or 11, and my brother was severely schizophrenic. He would be awake all night, suffering and having battles with the demons in his mind. My sister in the next room over was trying to sleep when she heard an evil voice say in her ear, "Get to sleep." I know that his sickness is something of his mind, but maybe his suffering and my family being upset over it made us susceptible to evil things. So, I have 3 older brothers. I don't speak to the eldest 2 for personal reasons, but the youngest of my brothers is pretty much my soulmate. He and the second youngest lived on our reservation with my dad for most of their lives, while I was in the city with my mom. As you can probably imagine, native reservations are a hotbed of supernatural activity. Between all of the legends and folklore, pretty much everyone living on the reserve has a strange story to share. I'm not going to pretend like it's a great place to raise a family, because while it's a beautiful piece of land, it has a pretty high suicide and crime rate. The only brother I like, who I'll refer to as Michael, had to navigate through a lot of tricky and dangerous situations growing up, and because of it, he's hardened and become a bit of a tough ass. Even though Mike's dealt with all manner of shitheads, nothing ever scared him more than the weird, creepy happenings that went on around town. At the house he used to live in, the backyard stretched out into the forest nearby, and he and our 2 younger cousins, Ryan and Sam, used to run around in it like children, climbing trees, making bonfires, hacking down bush with machetes, hunting, blowing shit up, etc. All fun outdoorsy stuff. The forest was so large, they could easily spend a few hours wandering around, and they were smart enough to pack supplies in case they were out there for longer than expected. At one point, during one of their many adventures, they came to a section of the bush they hadn't come across before. It is not unusual, considering the size. But something that was unusual was how quiet it was in this particular area of the forest. There were no sounds of birds chirping, bullfrogs croaking, or anything else scurrying around in the fallen leaves and broken branches. They stood in absolute silence and waited for something, anything, to make a noise, whether it was a twig snapping or the wings of a bird suddenly flapping above. Mike said that you could hear your own heartbeat, that's how quiet and still it was. Ryan pointed out that it was ducking creepy, and not wanting to spend another second standing around waiting for something to happen, he turned away from the other 2 boys and walked back in the direction they had come from. Mike, curious but always one to trust his instincts, agreed shortly after and trailed behind him, leaving our youngest cousin Sam in the eerily calm clearing. He waited there for just a little while longer, expecting some sort of monster to come bounding through the trees to attack once they had all turned their backs, and then hurried away to catch up with Mike and his brother, Ryan. The forest was dense, which is partly why they would bring axes and machetes to make it easier to navigate on their later travels, so he no longer had a view of either of them but could still hear as their bodies trampled through the bush ahead. Following the noise, he was caught off guard by a tiny shape darting behind a nearby tree. He stopped and gazed intently at the large tree trunk, hoping that it had only been his eyes playing tricks on him, but ready to confront whatever it might be. The figure carefully peeked out from behind its cover and then ran off in an entirely different direction than Sam was headed. Immediately he took off after it, half of him anxious to get a better look at the tiny creature and the other half inexplicably compelled to follow it. It always stayed a few meters in front of him, using the forest to its advantage, so that Sam couldn't get a real sense of what it looked like. He said he must have run for only a few minutes when, all of a sudden, they both stopped at the ominously quiet clearing. Strange creature aside, Sam told my brother and Ryan that it freaked him out because he hadn't been chasing the thing anywhere close to where they found the silent trees. Yet somehow he ended up back there, face to face with literally a tiny person. Like the creature I'd seen hanging out in my backyard, he said its skin was gray and it had pointed ears. The face was definitely reminiscent of a human, but Sam said that there was something unsettling about the way it looked and smiled at him. Without a sound, it beckoned him to follow, and this is where it gets even weirder. Even though Sam said he was absolutely horrified, it was as if every fiber of his being yearned to follow this thing wherever it went. And he did. It led him all throughout the forest, going deeper and deeper, the trees becoming quite a pain trying to weave through. It seemed the further he got, the quieter it became, with the only sound coming from their footsteps. Every now and then, the tiny man would look over his shoulder at Sam, the same devious grin on his face, until Sam needed to stop from exhaustion. He figured they'd been walking around for almost an hour now, and hunger was starting to set in. In retrospect, this probably saved my cousin's life because, as we paused to lean against a tree, the creature suddenly disappeared from sight. Sam explained that at that moment, all of the emotions he actually wanted to feel finally set in. The weird desire to follow this sprite further into the forest suddenly lifted from him, and he was left with total confusion and an overwhelming sense of dread. He had absolutely no idea where he was, and too shaken to continue trekking through the forest, Sam curled into a ball on the ground and began to cry. He figured that was it, he was going to be another one of those missing kids that nobody finds until a couple of weeks later, dead under a pile of moldy leaves. But in my family, we're strong sons of ditches, with a B. We've been to hell and back, and we don't stop fighting until we're good and dead. Confident that both Mike and his brother Ryan were looking for him after quickly realizing he hadn't followed them back, he got up to brush himself off and try to find his way. Luckily, it only took half an hour or so before Sam stumbled on a frantic Mike, who started screeching for Ryan. I found him. Thank God I ducking found him. My brother grabbed Sam by the front of his shirt and yanked him toward their house, and it gets even creepier still. First of all, both my brother and Ryan remarked on how rough Sam looked when they found him. He was absolutely filthy, his face looked pale and gaunt, basically all of the markings of a teenager who just spent days lost in the forest. Second, it was only until Sam had found Mike and Ryan that he realized what time it must have been because they were carrying flashlights and it was as if it had become dark instantaneously. Sam swears he was only gone for a couple of hours at most, but Mike gave him a really worried look after exchanging glances with Ryan and said, "No, Sam, you've been gone for at least 6 or 7 hours. At first we thought you were just being a duck, so we stood at the edge of the forest in my backyard calling for you to come out, and after a few minutes we knew something was up, so we began looking for you." They even stopped to have dinner and checked around to see if anybody had seen him, just in case, before heading back into the bush to continue searching for him. That's why Sam felt so tired, exhausted, and hungry. All of the boys headed out at around 2 p.m., spent a couple of hours farting around, and then the plan was to head home a little after 4 o'clock to make some dinner. Sam didn't leave the forest until it was well after 10 p.m. At first, I just laughed because I thought it was bullshit, but when I actually visited my family on the reserve, not only did Ryan verify the story as true, as well as a few other friends around town that both Mike and Ryan approached when they were searching for him, but Sam was visibly disturbed by the topic. He doesn't like to talk about it. Understandably so, because Sam was only 15 years old when this happened to him. We tried to ask him more about what the Pukka looked like, but all we got was, "Duck off, man. I don't want to make it worse by talking about it." Which makes sense because a lot of native people from my tribe are incredibly superstitious. We believe that even just uttering the name of certain monsters will bring them into your life, so it's considered extremely disrespectful to openly talk about it with other people, lest you curse them too. Pukwudgies can be known for stealing and killing children, and they don't like it when you make direct eye contact with them. It's said that while they used to be friendly and, at times, even helpful toward us, they no longer feel that way and won't hesitate to act violently if someone encroaches on their territory. My brother believes it played an incredibly dangerous trick on our cousin that day by distorting his perception of time so he'd continue to follow the creature until he died of exhaustion. I used to live in Vancouver, Washington, on a cul-de-sac Orchard Del CT. It was a T-shaped cul-de-sac with another road going off of the side of the T. So I was heading to school at about 8 a.m. that morning. I only had to walk about a block from my house to where the cul-de-sac meets the main road, St. James Road. This was your typical everyday route that I took. However, that morning was different. When I got close to St. James, I looked up from my feet, and across the road was what I could only describe as a creature. It was made entirely of black spheres. In the shape of a man, it definitely had 2 legs, 2 arms, a torso, and a head. But again, they are all made up of black spheres about a foot wide, a little bigger than a basketball. All of the spheres had a texture to them that I had never seen before. That is creepy enough, but it was dancing around a pole across the street. The thing is, and that's really hard to convey, that this thing projected nothing but pure malevolence. I felt that this thing was bad. Really, really bad. I would not say it was evil, it was just bad. It's like the difference between saying a man can be evil but a man can also be good. This thing could not have the possibility of being good, there was no way. It was bad through and through. Anyway, when I looked at it, it stopped dancing, looked at me, and just popped out of existence. It did not fade. It did not make any sound. It was just there one moment, and the next moment it was gone. I was very freaked out, but it wasn't like I was hurt or felt bad, I was just freaked out. Anyway, I just went to school like normal, if not a little shaken. Well, that night there were some kids racing cars drunk, and there were 4 or 5 people who killed the driver, and all the passengers all died instantly. When I went out with my father to the corner where it happened, I was shocked because it was the exact same intersection where I saw that thing the previous morning. I cannot help but think I saw something strange that morning. Something I was not supposed to see. Whatever that creature was, it was bad news. When I was 13, I had a dream where I was in my basement, and I got a phone call on an old flip phone lying on a random table. I can't remember entirely what he said, but he basically said, "Hey dude, pour this chemical on the bodies to bring them back to life." I was like, WTF? Bodies? I turned around, and lo and behold, there were half a dozen pale human bodies in my basement. I distinctly remember that one had both arms chained to the brick wall. I, naturally, freaked the duck out and ran for the stairs. At the same time, my dad was walking down the stairs to get something. I told him everything that happened. But in the middle of my explanation, he gave me this weird look and then immediately dropped to the floor and started having what appeared to be a seizure. My vision began flashing with bright lights and vibrant polygonal shapes. The shapes shifted and warped violently, almost like the world was glitching out. I began to hear many loud sounds at once. It was like a total assault on my senses. I could faintly hear my dad yelling for me as my vision began to completely fail, melting into a mess of shapes and lights. I woke up from the dream completely dumbfounded. Now, this wouldn't have been as big of a deal if it weren't for the fact that it was my dad's birthday that day. More importantly, it was his first birthday since his death a little over a year earlier. I don't know if he was trying to communicate beyond the grave or something, but I've never gotten a proper explanation. Something very peculiar happened to me a few years ago, but being somewhat of a skeptic, I'm still a bit hesitant to label it as paranormal. I live on one of the larger English-speaking Caribbean islands. One of the most interesting and yet complex things about us is that our culture was born through an amalgamation of cultures, particularly European and African. That is something that manifests itself in many facets of our daily lives, in particular the food we eat, our Creole language, music, and, of course, religion. A prime example of this is a religion here that combines Christian revivalism with West African ancestor worship and spirit possession. Since the country is traditionally Protestant, many people have historically regarded their practice of trying to attract spirits with much disdain and fear. The reason I mention this is because, despite living with my parents in an upscale community, there was a poorer community right next to us that I assumed had one of these churches. Sometimes, right before bed, I would lay in the dark and listen to the distant drums and chanting right before I would fall asleep. It would always begin at the oddest hours, starting shortly before midnight and then gradually rising in volume until shortly before 3. This went on for years, and my other family members heard it too. The chanting and drumming never got loud enough to disturb the peace, and I never felt creeped out or threatened. The only strange thing that I could never understand was that on the few occasions when I tried to look and see where it was coming from, I could never actually pinpoint a specific location. One summer when I was in my late teens, a few of my cousins came over to stay. For some reason, everyone decided on going to bed early that night, but I decided to stay up a little later and watch some TV. After flicking through the channels for a bit, I realized that nothing worth watching was on, and I headed to bed. Let me rephrase that, I actually sat in a chair in my room and fell asleep there while reading a book. Not that long after I fell asleep, I remember waking up in blind terror. For a few seconds, I couldn't tell what had frightened me, but my heart was pounding and my hair felt as if it were standing on end. It had taken me a few seconds to realize that the drumming and chanting I had fallen asleep to had gotten to be so deafeningly loud that it sounded like a parade passing by the road in front of my house. My instincts were screaming at me not to move, but it didn't matter because it felt like I had undergone some kind of temporary paralysis. I remember sitting there like a statue, too terrified to cry, and grasping the handles of the couch tightly while I waited for whatever it was to pass by. Every single minute felt like an hour, and I remember thinking that if it wasn't over soon, my heart might give out. At some point, the thought occurred to me that I could not hear a single dog in the neighborhood barking, and despite the pandemonium, not a single one of the 10 people staying in the house woke up. When the noise finally stopped, I got brave enough to look through one of the windows at the front of the house. The road was completely clear. There was no evidence to show that anything had occurred at all. Not a single light turned on, nothing. I tried waking my parents to ask if they had heard, but they seemed like they were in a deep slumber. I eventually decided on heading back to the chair in my room and curling up under a sheet until I eventually fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning and mentioned the noise, no one admitted to hearing a thing. I even asked one of my neighbors out of desperation, and nothing. I know I did not dream or imagine it since I was wide awake for most of the night. But you want to know the most peculiar thing about it all? I never heard the drumming or the chanting again. At least 10 years have passed, and although my parents still live there, they never hear the chanting and drumming anymore either. I've even tried looking for the church and still can't find it. It's like it never existed in the first place. So this is a story that happened a couple of years ago. So at the time, my cousin was living with his mom, and they lived in a pretty big house. The day I arrived at his place, he told me about an experience he had 2 nights ago. He was chilling in his room when suddenly the handle on his door turned. He looked at the door, and for about 5 minutes, the handle just kept turning as if someone were trying to open the door. He never keeps his door locked, so it was strange that the door never actually opened. He called out his mom's name a few times, but she was asleep. He checked the time, and it was 3:13 a.m. apparently. 3 a.m. is supposed to be the devil's hour. The next day, he was visiting his aunt and told her the story. She gave him a weird look and asked him what time this happened. She then told him that around 3:10 a.m. the same night, she heard someone knocking on her bedroom window. The knocking went on for roughly 10 minutes, and then it just stopped. Fast forward to the first night I spent at his place. We were just chilling in his room, talking. He was sitting on his bed, and I was sitting up against his bedroom door. Suddenly, we both heard 3 quick, loud knocks on the door, and his door handle started turning. I looked at the door, expecting his mom to walk in. It was pretty late, and we were being kind of loud. But nothing happened. We both looked at each other and instantly knew we needed to check the time. It was 3:05 a.m. We sat for a while, waiting to see if anything else would happen to the door. Nothing happened. After a few minutes, we both settled down and went back to chatting. All of a sudden, we heard a crash coming downstairs from the kitchen. It sounded like a bunch of pots and pans had fallen to the ground. This happened at 3:12 a.m. We immediately ran out of the room to his mom's room to check on her. She was fast asleep. After mustering up some courage, we were both freaking out. We decided to go downstairs together to investigate. It was really creepy because it was pitch black downstairs as all the lights were off. It seemed like the longest walk of my life when it only took me 20 seconds to walk over to the kitchen. We turned on the lights, and scattered across the floors were a bunch of pots and pans that were stored in a closed cupboard. We cleaned everything up and went back upstairs. The next day, we told his mom about everything that happened. His mom, being a big believer in the paranormal, told us that the events were no coincidence, as 3 a.m. was the ghost hour. I'll leave it up to you to decide if we had a genuine paranormal experience or if we were just imagining stuff, but this would have to be the second scariest experience I've had. The first can be a story for another day. When I was 18 but still in high school, I moved in with a friend who had this huge house to herself. Her parents owned it, and it was on their property, but it wasn't super close. They owned a good chunk of land. It was an old house with an old steel or brick fireplace in the den. The fireplace had a heavy door that shut and latched with effort to heat the house. We always built a good fire and then shut the door and locked it before bed. One night I was brushing my teeth, and I heard that big, heavy steel door open. I assumed it was my roommate checking on the fire, but when I called out to her, I could tell she was in her room, opposite the den with the fireplace. So I walked over to peek into the room and noticed the shadows from the fire dancing on the walls. The steel door was wide open. I walk into my friend's room and crawl into her bed. I said, "If you didn't open the door, why is it wide open?" As soon as the sentence left my mouth, we both heard that steel door slam shut. It shook the walls. It slammed so hard. It scared the absolute duck out of both of us. It sounded like a ducking train was smashing through. She wanted to call her dad, who lived down the road, but I argued it was 3 a.m. and he would kill us if we woke him up. So we decided to go check it out ourselves. Armed with flashlights and baseball bats, we slowly walked towards the den. But when we got to the room, that door was not only shut, it was locked. There's no way that door could have done it on its own. It was not only heavy but also a bitch to lock once it was hot enough. It took the both of us to get it shut. But I know I saw that door open, and I know we both heard it slam and jump at the same time. This living situation wasn't exactly the best for me, but I liked the freedoms it gave me. But over the next few weeks, it was severely impacting me. My usual goofy, class clown self was now quiet and spacey. My friends at school kept asking me, what the hell was wrong with me? The truth is, I think that house was sucking the life out of me. There was no TV, no radio, not even a house phone. It was out in the country, and I did not have a car, so I was limited in getting anywhere, and eventually my roommate was staying over at her new boyfriend's house full time. So there I was, in this huge house, out in the middle of nowhere, with no phone. This was late 90s. I stopped building fires. I stopped eating. I remember sitting in that den and just staring at the wall until I realized I'd sat there until the sun went down and didn't realize the house was dark. I remember lying in bed, and the room next to mine, the one we didn't use, made all kinds of noises in the night. Scratching and wood groaning as if someone were walking around. That room was full of furniture. You couldn't walk around in there. I just kept telling myself it's the mice. Finally, I just couldn't take it anymore, and I called my family to come and get me. The day my family came, my grandma, who doesn't believe in ghosts, she's JW, said she went into my old room to check and make sure we got everything and said she swore she heard someone laughing. I've never been back to that house. A few months ago, my uncle invited me to go to a well-known paranormal hotspot with him and his group. I've always been open-minded about the paranormal, as I've had other experiences with what I believe to be spirits or ghosts. The place in question is an old, out-of-use prison used to hold political prisoners, murderers, etc. Me and my uncle arrived first, and so he thought he would show me around. We walked down every wing, long dark hallways leading from the main foyer, all with prion cells on each side, of course. The least frightening experience was when I saw a dark figure standing there, and when I looked at my uncle and looked back, it was gone. This is when I realized my belief in the paranormal had been well placed. He then showed me a room, or cell. The reason I call it a room is because it was the most luxurious cell. It had comfortable pillows, a big soft mattress, and a bookcase to top it all off, the very bookcase that, when slid over, leads to the room the prisoner would be hanged in. The noise came from the ceiling, and a large glass floor came down and led to the coffin room. Before my uncle showed me what was behind the bookcase, I saw a huge white flash come from the cracks behind the bookshelf. I get chills as I'm writing this. After my uncle opened the bookcase, I saw a large black figure peek over his shoulder. This terrified me. It seemed normal to him. Under the prison, there is a long, dark tunnel that leads to the old courthouse across the road. As an initiation, they made me walk to the end of the tunnel with all the lights off, knock on the rusty metal door at the end, and ask for Sir. When I came within 5 feet of that door, I felt a horrible feeling, like something was waiting for me. I strongly hesitated. But I knocked on the door and asked for it, Sir. As I walked briskly back to the group, I heard them all exclaim. They said something and walked back with me, a dark figure. I didn't believe them until someone else did it, and I promise you, a large black figure came slowly from the wall and walked behind him. I thought, because it was so dark, it was just another person walking with them, until I remembered he walked down alone. I would say my mother has medium abilities. She doesn't like talking about it, but when she feels like it, she tells us. We visited Hot Springs, Arkansas, last weekend, and I can't stop thinking about it. We went up the observation tower, and my mother told us she could feel spirits all over the forest. She said they were sad, and she could hear them crying. I wasn't surprised because the city experienced multiple floods and fires over the centuries, but still, it was really interesting that she could feel emotions. We visited the Fordyce Bath House Museum the next day. The building showed how the bath house was back in the day and displayed little facts and history about the different rooms. My mom felt really strong spirits in the men's bath quarters. She said the spirits were angry, and she didn't want us to be alone or stay too long in those quarters. Whenever my brother and I strayed behind and she moved on to the next room, she always called us to hurry up and move out. When my brother said he needed to go poop, I told him the bathroom was down the stairs into what looked like a basement staircase leading to underground. Probably the spirits were very strong, and she didn't tell me why, but my mom was adamant about not going down there. She told my brother to hold his poop and wait because she wasn't going to let him down those stairs. Hot Springs is such a mysterious place. I want to look to see if any crimes or huge scandals happened in the Fordyce Bath House, but I literally can't find anything. I read that the large Arlington Hotel had a lot of hauntings, but I can't find any suspicious stories that happened in Hot Springs back in the day, except that Al Capone and gangsters used to chill and do business there. Also, there is a large rehabilitation center, which is the largest building in the town. I heard it was an insane asylum, but I'm not sure if it's abandoned or not. It was private property when I was walking around the area, but when I looked online, Google said it was a career training institute. Does anyone know any stories about this place? Can people actually go inside this building? I don't expect anyone to know anything about this small town, but if there's any insight into or truth about my mother's paranormal feelings, then please share. Back in the 90s, we lived in a trailer from the 60s or 70s, and it was run down so badly that the only place that would retain heat was in the living room. Well, I was young, and my mother and I were sleeping in the living room to keep warm with a good view into the kitchen area. In the middle of the night, we heard a noise and looked in that direction, and we both saw two distinct white, translucent apparitions float into and out of the kitchen. We have never talked about it, but I definitely remember that as a child. Going back further, when I was in kindergarten, we lived in another house, and in the room I was in, I would wake up every night with nightmares or night terrors, but only in that room. Apparently the realtor, after the fact, told my mom that a man died in that room before we bought that house. My dad said he never saw my mother slap a person until the day she was told that. Personally, I was never much of a believer in the paranormal until this experience. I was raised in a religious home, so the idea isn't foreign to me, but honestly, I never put much stock into it. To this day, this remains what I'd consider my only truly paranormal experience, although there are a few other things that I'd chalk up to more glitch-type events. Anyway, I staffed at a Boy Scout summer camp in southeast Missouri, nestled on a huge and mostly unused property surrounded by the Ozarks/Mark Twain National Forest. Just a few minutes outside the property is a small hilltop park converted from a retired forest ranger's fire tower. It's got wooden stairs that lead about halfway up the tower to an enclosed, chain-link, platform where you can observe the landscape for a few miles. It was often frequented by other staffers on their respective nights off, and sometimes you'd run into some less savory locals that mostly used it for drugs and related debauchery. It was a popular place among staffers as it provided a tranquil and relaxing space to just chill out away from the chaos of camp. I had been there many times in the 2 years prior to my third summer. It was always a normal and quiet place. So one Saturday evening during my third year, my girlfriend at the time was visiting, and I wanted to take her to all the cool spots. So after dinner and a movie, I took her to the fire tower. It wasn't super late, although it was the darker side of twilight, but when we arrived, we were the only ones there. Although not out of the ordinary, this was slightly unusual as all the camps on the property shared Saturday nights off outside of special weekend events we hosted once or twice a summer. Thinking nothing of it, I told my girlfriend that I just wanted to sit in the truck for a minute. I had a '94 Chevy S10 with a sick turquoise camper shell. We rolled down the windows and enjoy the cool evening summer breeze. Not even a minute or two later, my girlfriend asks me, "Hey, what's that noise?" And I perk up because I hadn't noticed anything at all. I'm straining to listen to some sort of foreign sound when I hear what sounds like drum beats being produced from midair in a big ring around the car. The individual beats would sound at different distances and elevations with no discernible rhythm or pattern. It sounded a lot like the drums in the deep from the Fellowship of the Ring, although it didn't get so intense so quickly. We're both sitting there, a little bewildered, when I start to scan the area for the source of the noise. I look up and down the tower to see if anyone's needlessly stomping their feet as hard as possible on the wooden steps, creating an echoing noise. Nobody. I look down at the little bench area at the bottom of the tower. Nothing. I check the parking lot again to see if I somehow missed another parked vehicle on our way in. Nope, we're the only ones there. By this point, I know that something weird is going on, so I roll up the windows and lock the doors. The girl is still confused, but she's never been here before, so she doesn't realize how unnatural this sound is. The drum beats have picked up in pace by now, and it seems like they're slowly but steadily closing in on the truck, getting louder and louder. The hair on my arms and neck stands up straight, and as I can tell, the beats are actually approaching us in the truck. All of a sudden, I hear a beat right behind the camper shell window right behind the cab of the truck. I fling myself around to see if there's anything in the bed of my truck, but I see nothing. However, as soon as I turn over my right shoulder to look back, I expose my back to the driver's side window, and immediately a drum beat happens just outside my window. Just typing this up, I still get a chill down my back, as whatever this was felt intentional and intelligent. It picked the bed first because my back was exposed and vulnerable, and then got me to turn around and do it again, as if it were taunting me. At this point, dread washed over me, and I felt like we needed to leave immediately, otherwise, we would be in serious ducking danger. My fight or flight kicked in so hard that I started crying uncontrollably, flying down the gravel road entirely too fast to be safe. The noise did not follow or pursue, but needless to say, when we got back to the camp, I was so shaken that I had to go straight to bed. I've been back a few times since, but nothing like this has ever happened again. I asked some other camp staff buddies if they had experienced or heard of something like that at the fire tower, but nobody had anything noteworthy to say. My ex-girlfriend still remembers that night but maintains that she never felt any fear, just curiosity about what could be making the noise. Like I said before, this particular experience basically changed my mind about the paranormal. I still don't know what I believe, but I know this was a real event, and I know it was something. I just have no idea what it actually was. If anybody has any thoughts or ideas, I'm very open to hearing what you think. My dad's stories. He served in the Taiwanese Marines as a drill sergeant. Much of the ground in Taiwan saw violence under occupation, and it was rumored his base was built on or near a mass grave. Needless to say, he's had a few paranormal stories. He had a guy report to him in the morning, exhausted but frazzled. The night before, he had been on guard duty, overlooking the firing range. The targets on the range were a mix of clay and wood figures, cut and drawn to look like an enemy soldier aiming a rifle at you. According to the guard, When he'd been bored out of his mind staring out over the range, he saw clear as day one of the clay soldiers wearily lay down his rifle and exclaimed, "Damn, I'm tired." The guard said he passed out from fright. During the evening, when training was over, the sergeants, for the most part, had time to themselves. My dad liked to go snake hunting during dusk, when the heat was rising from the ground and the snakes came out of their holes. So one evening he sets out, carrying a bag, a nice long stick, and a flashlight. As he was making his way across the field, zigzag in a search pattern, he found himself getting closer and closer to an old, decrepit outhouse that had been abandoned as it was too far from the main base. As he got within a few yards of it, he was hit with a sudden feeling of apprehension. Something told him going near the outhouse was a bad idea. At that moment, his flashlight, aimed right at the construct, went out. He fiddled with the battery, smacked it, thought, "Duck, better get a new battery," and turned around to head back. The moment he turned and faced the main base, the flashlight flickered back on. Great, time to keep hunting. The moment he turned to face the outhouse, it flickered off again. Faced with the base, it flickered on. He did this 2 or 3 times, got the message, verbally apologized for intruding, turned, and walked calmly back to base. The base itself was surrounded by forest and mountains, the natural terrain of Taiwan. One day a soldier was reported missing. As the day went on, it was clear that he'd either deserted or was in serious trouble. A manhunt/rescue team was organized, and most of the base was out searching for the guy as the rain started to come in. As night fell, they called it off and got ready to try again tomorrow. They found him in the morning, huddled in a wet, dark cave, scared, speechless, and out of his mind. No one was sure what he saw to cause him to freak out, and they never found out. They shipped the guy out soon afterwards. Finally, one of his years on the base was hit by a huge typhoon. Typhoons are pretty regular in Taiwan, especially during the summer, but this one was going to set records. Everyone hunkered down and reinforced the base as best they could, and it held well. After days of relentless rain and wind, they emerged to survey the damage. One of the trees on base had been hundreds of years old. It sat on a hill and overlooked the base, and so had been the site of a Buddhist shrine set at its roots. Now the roots twisted and turned into the air. The storm had torn the tree from the ground. And yet, the shrine itself was untouched. Even the red silk covering, with nothing weighing it down, hadn't moved an inch despite the winds that had finally torn the great tree from its hill after hundreds of years. The soldiers took this as a sign that, despite whatever would be thrown against them, their spirit would remain strong and unmoved. We later figured out that my late father was haunting us. He ended himself when I was very young. Unexplainable things would happen to me, and the rest of my family, but we didn't speak to each other about it until years later because we were afraid to sound crazy. As I grew up, and even though it was obviously paranormal, I refused to believe it for years. That is, until I was in high school and my brother and I experienced something terrifying together. We moved into another house, and I still hated being home alone or even in the home at all because the incidents kept occurring. If I was home alone, the house had a heavy, eerie feeling of being watched at all times, and I wasn't religious, but I would pray out loud. Footsteps, rummaging in the kitchen, drawers and cabinets being opened, and 3 slow knocks on the living room wall were always common occurrences. I, 16 years old at the time, was home alone, and the rhythmic 3 knocks on the living room wall, there was an attic space behind that wall that always gave us intense anxiety to be inside of it, was the only noise in the house that accompanied me. My heart raced, and I said my prayer out loud. It would stop and then continue. The feeling of being watched was so intense, and a dreadful, ominous atmosphere felt suffocating. The knocking continued. Thankfully, my 13-year-old brother got home from school and started playing video games in the living room. I sat behind him and watched him play. Usually, when another family member would arrive home, the awful atmosphere and odd noises would cease. This time, they continued. My brother and I whipped our heads to the knocks and then to each other. He asked, "Did you hear that?" I shook my head yes, and he goes, "That usually only happens when I'm home alone." I was shocked and said, "Me too. It always freaks me out." I didn't know if I was the only one, and the knocking started again. My brother and I agreed to ignore it. All of a sudden, the air got muggier, the air was harder to breathe, it felt like a weighted blanket was on us, and we both verbally expressed suddenly getting a headache. The 3 knocks suddenly came at a faster pace. My brother gets irritated and turns the volume up on the TV. The knocks get louder and faster. My brother suddenly flipped out and started yelling at the wall, "Shut the duck up, stop knocking, I swear to God," and he kept going. The knocking stopped while he was raging. My brother slammed the Xbox controller on the ground and sat back down. I was surprised that the knocking stopped. It was eerily silent for about 3 seconds, Then it sounded like someone was banging a table against the wall. It hit the wall so hard it shook the entire living room. It was so violent and loud. It was as if I could literally feel the wrath of whoever or whatever was angry with us down to my core. The feeling is something I will never forget. My brother and I immediately burst into tears, screaming. We began running downstairs, and I didn't turn around, but I heard these thunderous footsteps just behind me as I flew through the house and followed my brother outside. We did not go back inside until our mom got home from work. I've always been interested in the paranormal and witnessed or experienced some events that I can't explain to this day, but I'm a very rational person, so I always brush them off while keeping an open mind, of course. But one of those experiences left me with no doubt. My current girlfriend used to work at a cafe or bakery in an old building in Bordeaux. She used to close at night alone because she was the store manager and stayed after the crew was done to count the register, do all the paperwork, etc. The bakery was made of the storefront, the kitchen in the back, and the office in the back as well. There's also a second floor, which is only storage and the changing rooms for the staff. The building isn't shared, it was only the cafe/bakery. She told me she felt uneasy as soon as she started her first shift there. Most nights, she'd hear running footsteps upstairs, the TVs in the sitting area for the customers turning on and off randomly, and the front door's doorbell ringing while the door was not moving. All that when she was alone. Another coworker she was close with shared the same experiences with her. I believed her because she has a history of paranormal encounters and is very serious about that stuff, but I wasn't convinced. Until I witnessed it. I also worked in the food industry, so I was rarely off when she was working too. One Sunday, I was off, so I decided to come pick her up and spend the last 30 to 45 minutes of her workday, which she usually spends alone with her this time. She gave me a tour of the place, and it did feel uneasy. But nothing significant happened, except for some rattling noises upstairs. Until I mentioned how quiet her ghost of the bakery was. She was counting the register in the office, in the back of the store. I was leaning against the wall in the corridor leading to the office, my back turning away from the storefront. To my right, there was the dishwashing room. There was no door to this room, just an opening in the corridor. To better visualize, I was facing towards the office, watching my girlfriend, turning my back to the storefront, leaning against the wall, but seeing the dishwashing room in my peripheral vision. Jokingly, I tell her, "I'm glad your ghost decided to leave us alone tonight." Not 1 second after I finish my sentence, the pile of glasses and dishes in the dishwashing room goes flying. I saw the whole room clearly in my side vision, and there was no one or nothing that could have done that. There was a pile of glasses stacked up in a pyramid, and they flew as if someone ran their hand through the base. It wasn't one glass tripping and bringing down the pyramid, it was legit pushed off. She just told me, "I told you he's always there," since she's used to stuff like this happening. She was almost done, so we stayed less than 10 minutes in there, but I could feel a different level of oppression and uneasiness for the whole time. This one sticks with me because there is no rational explanation. I saw the dishes go flying around, and it was a direct response to my joke. Well, I was with my girlfriend at the time, and we were staying the night at her mother and siblings' house. She had warned me ahead of time that the house had some definite negative spirits inside, but I wasn't too concerned. Little did I know, I should have been. We got there before the sun went down, so the upstairs wasn't as bad. But once the sun set, it was another story. The entire presence and atmosphere had changed, it was a completely different feeling. It was uncomfortable, to say the very least. But she was with me, so I felt I'd be okay. We were upstairs getting ready to go to sleep, and I had to use the bathroom, which was all the way on the opposite side of the hallway. The hallway started where the room we were in was and circled around her mother's room, which was dead center upstairs. So it was a really long hallway. Now keep in mind that I had been in this house before, but only during the day when the hallway was lit up from the windows, as there was only one light in the hallway and the switch was by the bathroom. She had left the bathroom light on for me when she came out, so I could see somewhat. The hallway was creepy enough, but as soon as I got to the bathroom, I began to feel extremely uneasy, uncomfortable, and unable to be in there alone because I wasn't. Something was there with me, and it did not want me there. I raced back to the bedroom, feeling like I had followed her the whole way, and asked her to accompany me. She did, but I was still really uneasy. We went to bed with no further incidents. Yet. Now the scary part is that after the following happened, the clock read exactly 3:15 a.m. I don't even remember falling asleep, or being tired enough to, for that matter. I remember feeling as if I had just been jolted awake by something. I sat up, and my girlfriend opened her eyes and asked if I was okay, and I said yeah, I just had to get comfortable again. A light on the wall went by, as if a car went by, so we thought nothing of it, as the city we lived in had traffic at all hours. But as soon as it reached the other side of the wall, it reversed direction, went back to where it started, and kept moving back and forth, getting faster and faster. We both started getting freaked out, so she wrapped her arms around me. As soon as she did, it was as if we were in the middle of a small twister. There was something circling us, creating wind and making us unable to move. Then, and this is straight out of Paranormal Activity, I began to literally be dragged out of bed by my right ankle. She was still holding on to me, so she started to get pulled along with me. Once I hit the floor, I was being dragged on my left side towards the bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black, so I could see nothing but black getting closer and closer as I lost grip of my girlfriend's hand. My feet reached the door, and all I felt was frigid air, and then my girlfriend woke me up. She looked panicked, and I was shaking like crazy. She said that I had been screaming at the top of my lungs in my sleep, and she couldn't wake me up. I was terrified, as I could still feel my ankle throbbing from where I was being pulled, and my side felt as if I had rug burn. I was literally so scared that I started crying. She went back to sleep a little while after I told her what happened, and the door to the bedroom was shut, but I refused to close my eyes again until the sun started peeking through the window, which was around 6 in the morning. I told her I would never stay in that house after dark again. And I never did. I was working the night shift in an old SIF that was originally built back in the 1950s. I was starting to feel sleepy, so I went for a walk to wake myself up and ended up getting lost in the maze of underground tunnels, finding myself in a part of the complex that obviously hadn't been used in decades. Everything looked like it was just left there and forgotten one day, eerily frozen in time. I was extremely tired and stressed out from work, and that really didn't help me to be able to rationally retrace my steps. Everything around me seemed like something was hiding in the shadows and watching me. It took a long time, but I finally made it back to my position and didn't tell anyone what happened. Luckily, it was the night shift, and no one noticed I was gone. A year later, we got a new guy, and in the middle of the night shift, he got up and went for a walk. A couple of hours later, he came back looking like he'd seen a ghost. I just gave him a knowing nod, and he knew I knew exactly what he just went through. When I was a young teenager, my friend Nathan and I would often take my family's large sea kayak out across the nearby river to a small creek that was around half a kilometer away and shot off adjacent to an abandoned golf course. This creek was very slow moving compared to the large Hawkesbury River, and as a result, a lot of rubbish and debris would collect at the mouth of the creek before slowly being distributed throughout its length. Nathan and I spent a lot of time at this creek. We even built a small jetty to tie the kayak to using long sticks and baling twine from the hay bales that we used to feed the horses back at home. We used this jetty to moor the kayak while we navigated the mess of prickly pear cacti that guarded the borders of the golf course. The golf course itself was incredibly eerie. No animals, birds, or even insects could be heard or seen on it. Every noise that you made was echoed back at you from a nearby sandstone cliff face. The closest thing that we saw to an animal was the skeleton of a kangaroo, which we found around the second time that we went there. It was strange, as we had only been to the spot a week or so prior, and there was no corpse. Yet there, in the middle of the clearing, was a full kangaroo skeleton. The sun bleached and scattered. We picked up some of the bones and admired them closely. We remarked on what part of the skeleton we thought each bone was before tossing them aside. I took the skull back with me in the kayak and placed it on the bookshelf in my room when I got home that afternoon. I often took things back from outings. Nathan never did, but he was always on the lookout for things for me to collect. The next time that we went out to the creek, we decided to try our luck at exploring the waterway as far down as we could. We armed ourselves with machetes and a small hatchet that we had used when we built the jetty, and we set off. The journey was made extremely difficult by vines that spanned the creek from bank to bank, sunken logs, and dense river weed that made paddling nearly impossible. The water was full of garbage too. Broken tubes, life jackets, boat propellers. You name it, it had made its way here. As we made it through to a relatively rubbish-free area that had dark, ominous-looking water, I looked down briefly and saw what I thought was a doll's head just below the surface of the water. I stopped paddling to crane my neck to see it more clearly. It was definitely a doll's head. Around a foot below the surface. As if it were tethered there from the riverbed. It was looking up with a blank expression and light blue eyes. I instantly got a panicked feeling as I gazed at it. Before I could say anything, Nathan exclaimed, "Aw, cool." And he plunged his hand into the water. I could tell that he was surprised at how deep he had to reach to wrap his fingers around the head, but Nathan was a determined dude. He lifted his head out of the water and looked at me, grinning. Streams of water ran from his closed fist as he held it out toward me triumphantly. I took it reluctantly from him. It was a small doll's head, around 3 inches in diameter. The head was clearly sun damaged, and as a result, it had lost a lot of its paint features. There were no discernible pupils on the eyes, just the blue-colored irises. This gave the thing a really disturbing look. I shook my head at Nathan and placed the head on the front of the kayak to make it look like the figurehead of an old wooden ship. Nathan laughed. "Let's call him Bob," he said while still grinning. I gave him a deadpan look, trying not to laugh. "You're so original," I scoffed at him before turning around to resume paddling. I stopped immediately when I saw Bob staring straight back at me. I had not placed him like that. I had him placed facing outward. I knew that I had because his face creeped me out, and I did not want to look at it. Nathan was paddling while I had stopped, so we were moving at a good pace. As I was at the front of the boat, I was meant to keep an eye out for obstacles and call out if I saw anything ahead. I was entirely focused on Bob, however, as we struck a submerged tree and came to an abrupt stop. Everything on the kayak jumped forward as a result of this. Nathan, me, and our packed lunches and water bottles. Nothing too major happened. Everything on the kayak had jumped forward, that is, except for the doll's head. I had kept my eye on it the entire time, and it did not move even half an inch. It was like it was superglued to the boat. Nathan began teasing me about being blind, and I snapped at him to be quiet. He asked what was wrong, and I leaned to the right for him to see the head. I pointed and said, "It didn't move, dude," while half chuckling. Nathan moved forward to look at it closer. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. I picked up my paddle and took a slow stroke backward in the water to lightly hit the tree again. Once again, everything on the kayak jumped forward slightly as we struck the tree, except for Bob. He stayed perfectly still. Nathan laughed. "That's weird," he said, his voice trailing off. I reached out to turn Bob around on his spot, and he turned easily. "Let's go home," I said loudly. I was trying to wash away the heavy feeling that seemed to settle down on us. Nathan agreed, and we turned the kayak around to head home. I watched the head like a hawk. Bob never looked back at me on the trip home, though. When we got home, we packed everything that we could into our backpacks and lifted the kayak out of the water. The head was stuffed into my pocket. I had not told Nathan about how creeped out I was out of fear that he would give me shit or give him possible ammunition to play a dumb prank on me with it. Nathan was and still is my best friend, and he would absolutely have done that if I had told him, just as I would to him had the roles been reversed. I decided to just keep my mouth shut about the stupid doll head and hope that Nathan would simply forget about it. We trudged over my neighbor's backyard with the kayak, holding it by the handles at both ends. My pocket started to feel very warm. I stopped listening to Nathan's nonsense and began to focus more on the ever-increasing temperature of the head inside my pocket. Each time I thought, it can't get any hotter, somehow it would. It was not burning, it was more like the feeling of deep heat as it gets left on. I tried my best to ignore it. It was getting dark now, and I really wanted to get home. We dropped the kayak in the garage and put away the machetes and hatchet before making our way upstairs for dinner. I took a detour to my room to dump the head out of my pocket and onto my bed. I left it there while I left my room to join Nathan and my family for dinner. When Nathan and I finished dinner and entered my bedroom to go to sleep later on that night, the head was absent from my bottom bunk bed. Granted, my room was a mess, but it should still have been in the cleared spot on my bare mattress. I took a little time to look for it. Tossing the blankets and sheets aside and climbing on top to peer down through the gap between the bed and the wall. I could not see it anywhere. I was not concerned that I might not see it again. In fact, I was somewhat relieved that it was gone. However, I had a gnawing feeling that it was still around. Not watching me exactly, but just a presence. Nathan seemed to have forgotten about it, though. He never brought Bob back up again that night, and he climbed up to the top bunk and promptly fell asleep. I lay down on my bed and pulled the bundle of blankets haphazardly over the top of me, falling asleep quickly as well. The next day, I was awoken by the sounds of thumping noises coming from nearby. I got up out of bed to glance out of the window into the front paddock of our property to see my stepfather using the hatchet to hack at a tree stump that was much too large for the minuscule axe. My stepfather was a very smart man, but his grasp of common sense sometimes bordered on the absurd. I yawned, rubbing my eyes and turning around before opening them. I froze in place. On the shelf in front of the kangaroo skull was Bob. His eyes were looking once again directly into mine. I turned to look at Nathan, still sleeping on the top bunk, and instantly jumped up on the railing to punch him hard in the upper arm. He awoke with a pained cry and looked at me with a scowl. "What the hell, man?" he demanded. He lifted his other arm to place his palm over the spot that I had struck with the punch. "Like you don't know you, mofo," I said with a half-assed laugh. I was trying to mask the trembling tone in my voice. Nathan looked incredulously back at me. I stared at him to try to see if his stoic expression would falter. It always would when he played pranks. It did not, though. I shook my head and strafed across the railing so that the bookshelf was in his view. I pointed at the top shelf. "You didn't put it there?" I asked quietly. Nathan sat up to get a better look and shook his head. "Nah man. I would have had him facing outward anyway, you know I would have." I spun my head around so fast that I'm surprised my neck did not break. Sure enough, the head was now facing toward the kangaroo skull and not outward like before. I began shaking. Unable to hold myself up on the railing any longer, I dropped to the floor, stormed over to the bookshelf to pick Bob up, and took him out into the kitchen. I stepped on the pedal to open the chrome bin in there and threw him in there a lot harder than I needed to. I did not let the lid naturally close, instead choosing to slam it shut as a good measure. Nathan sleepily trudged out of my room once I had finished doing this. He stared wide-eyed at the bin. He took a moment before looking up at me and saying, "Yeah, that thing was creepy as hell, man." I was glad that Nathan agreed with me and was not using this opportunity to make fun of me. I nodded at him. "Something about it was just wrong," I uttered quietly. Nathan playfully kicked the bin, making it rock a little. "Take that creepy-ass doll head guy," he exclaimed while laughing. I laughed too. I felt glad that the situation was over and dealt with. I asked Nathan again if he had actually put the head on the shelf. Stating that if he had it, it was okay, it was a good prank. I just needed to know for my own sanity. Nathan put his hand over his heart and sternly promised that he had not done it. I believed him then and still do to this day, nearly 17 years later. Months went by. Nathan and I never had an opportunity to make our way back to the creek. With school holidays approaching, I was keen to get big chores out of the way on weekends so that I could enjoy the full extent of the holiday period. I did this by working on weekends with my stepfather on various projects on our rural property. We used the machetes and hatchet that Nathan and I had taken on our last trip to the creek in order to complete many of these tasks. Having no means to sharpen the tools, or even the knowledge for that matter, meant that the cutting and hacking got more difficult and cumbersome as time went on. One day, as I was fighting my way through a thicket of vines hanging from a large peppercorn tree, I observed my mother lean down to pick an object up out of the dirt in the front paddock. It was in a spot directly below the main household wheelie bins that the council picked up weekly. I thought nothing of it. A few hours later, I went inside to get a drink of water and to change my shirt, as I had managed to create a large tear in the one that I was wearing. I entered my room and immediately felt strange. I feel a need to look over at my bookshelf. The feeling of déjà vu was intense. Bob was back, staring at me again from the spot on the bookshelf that I had placed him on years earlier. This time, though, a small smirk was obvious on his features. I felt nausea sweep over me, and I turned around to walk back into the kitchen. "Mom?" I asked sheepishly. My mother didn't look up from doing the dishes. "Yes, honey?" she replied. "Did you put something on my shelf?" Mom murmured in agreement with me. "Yes, I found that doll's head in the front yard earlier. I saw it in your room earlier in the year and figured you had lost it somehow." This made no sense to me. Mom could not have seen it in my room. There was no time for her to do it. Furthermore, what a bizarre thing to do. I found a doll's head underneath the retaining wall that our bins sat atop and thought to wash it off and put it on my bookshelf. I shook my head and turned to walk back to my room. Determined to get rid of him for good this time. I marched straight up to the bookshelf, reached up to grab Bob, and paused. He was not there. I let out an exasperated sigh and began to violently push things aside on my bookshelf. First on the top shelf, then the second shelf all the way down until I start to fling things around in my room. He was nowhere to be found. I stopped, placed my hands on either side of my face, and took a minute to slow my breathing down. I walked briskly out of my room and grabbed the cordless phone off of the wall. I called Nathan to tell him what had happened. After I finished rattling off a summary of what had happened, he was speechless about what I had told him. We both had no idea what to make of all this. My stepfather, growing impatient with how long I was taking to come back, had also returned to the house and was standing over me with his hands on his hips, looking very annoyed. I told Nathan I had to go and hung up. My stepfather asked me where I had put the hatchet that I was using earlier. I looked confused. I had left it impaled into the impossibly large tree stump as always. He had watched me do it. I told him as much, and he said he could not find it. We both went back down to the paddock together, and sure enough, just like Bob, the hatchet had seemingly disappeared. I never saw Bob again, but the story does not end there. Years later, when Nathan and I were in our 20s, we decided to take the kayak and make our way back to the creek for old time's sake. We took the kayak out of the garage and carried it up the road to a launch ramp, as the neighboring property that we used to get to the river had changed owners some years ago. It took us about an hour to get to the creek, as opposed to our usual 20 minutes back in the day. When we arrived, we were very surprised to see that our jetty was still there, having survived 2 floods and over a decade of river tides. It honestly did not look like it was damaged in any way. It's almost like new. We stopped, moored the kayak to it as we had always done, and stepped out onto the shore. My foot kicked something up in the dirt, and I looked down to see the outline of a familiar shape. It couldn't be. I kneeled down and grasped at the handle of the object, pulling it out of the crumbling earth to reveal the hatchet that I had misplaced so many years ago. The casing bears my stepfather's monogram embossed into the dark leather. I shook my head. This was impossible. This hatchet was the only one we had purchased, and it was one of a kind. Nathan and I were the only ones that visited this spot outside of my family and anyone else that we knew. This made no sense whatsoever. Nathan looked at it quietly, along with me. A heavy feeling seemed to settle around us once again. We both turned to look at the wide berth of still water at the mouth of the creek. In the center, the bloated and rotting corpse of a cow floated innocuously, drifting lazily in a clockwise direction. A storm was setting in rapidly. Nathan and I looked at each other at the same time and knew that this was the last time we would ever be coming to Cat Eye Creek. So I've wanted to share this story for a long time due to some recent events. It started way before I was even born, so I suppose I should be there. First, I should say that although I was raised believing in aliens and ghosts and all sorts of paranormal or supernatural things, I do keep a healthy level of skepticism about myself. I don't equate everything to ghosts or other things. With that out of the way, on with the story. As I said, this begins with my mom. It began in the house my grandparents currently live in and that I lived in until I was 5 years old. My mom shared a room with her younger sister for quite some time, this time while she was in elementary school. They had beds adjacent to one another and a closet at the foot of their beds. Before the incident described, my mom had no problem with an open closet, but now she doesn't even let me or my siblings sleep with a closet open. It was a reoccurring thing that would happen when my mom would leave a closet open that she would wake up in the night and look over to her sister. Floating above her sister would be this black mass with glowing red eyes that would look at my mom when she noticed the thing. Once it saw my mom, it would return to the closet and turn into this large shadow man with red eyes. This entity was coined the Dark Man by my mom. Whatever it was, it obviously scared my mom and has lasting effects to this day. I've had weird experiences my entire life. With a chaotic home life after my parents' divorce when I was a year old, I suppose I would be an easy target. I'm not saying these were directly the Dark Man or even specifically a ghost, just a strange occurrence. The first was the fact I had nightmares every night while at my mom's, grandparents', until I got a dream catcher and moved out at 5. There are other small incidents, such as orbs in photos. I took consecutive ones in the same place so it wasn't dust or bugs or on the lens, footsteps walking down the hallway at 3 a.m. while everyone was asleep, feelings of being watched, and just general unease. That was all well and good, nothing serious until I used the Ouija board. I'm aware I was stupid to do so, but I thought it was a hoax, in all honesty. But after I did, I had the first nightmare in 9 years where my family was killed by a dark figure. I also had things like pots on the drying rack that could not have just fallen, causing noise by falling to the ground, people talking when I'm home alone, and other small things. But about a month ago, that was what made me write this. I do deal with depression and anxiety, so I'm on medication for it, but it's never caused sleep paralysis or any other sort of weird effect on my sleep. But one night I had fallen asleep around 10:30 just watching Vines, don't judge, so my mind wasn't on anything scary or paranormal when I fell asleep. I hadn't even gotten into any real dreams that I remember when I heard a voice telling me to wake up. When I did, I immediately saw a black figure standing over me. I could move, so it wasn't sleep paralysis since I was able to turn on my flashlight and run upstairs after less than a minute, after I had recovered from the shock. I had only been asleep for an hour, exactly 11:30 when I was able to grab my phone for the flashlight. I had my stepdad check the entire basement, but there was nowhere someone could have entered or left as quick as they did without being heard. The only possible explanation is a hallucination, but I've never hallucinated or had anything like that where I didn't know I was asleep. And to add to that, the day before I found a baby picture of mine turned upside down in a way only a person could have deliberately done. And given that my door is locked until I'm in it, there is no logical explanation. In any case, I hope to never see the figure again. In the summer of 2009, I lived in an older house in Bristol, Rhode Island, a historic coastal town with some of the only northern slave trade activity from what I'd been told, mostly unrelated to this story other than that the house was in a neighborhood of heritage homes from the late 1700s and had its fair share of creepiness. I was renting a level of it for my apartment, but it was 4 bedrooms with a couple huge closet areas and just me on the floor by myself. The first floor is totally unoccupied. There were a couple slight encounters that really bugged me out over time or in the moment, for sure. First, I had at least a half dozen experiences of seeing a person, out of the corner of my eye, through the open hallways that connected the kitchen, living room, and furthest bedroom, pass by just out of sight. Now, these were soundless moments, but it was usually the same type of motion, as if it were another person doing something totally mundane, and like I was inconsequential to their own path or action. Only once or twice did it feel or look like someone was watching me from just around the corner of a wall or partition before slipping out of view. I have to admit it would almost always be when I was tired, alone, or both, but it happened with a frequency that pushed it from just eyes playing tricks on me to bizarre to damn it not again. It got to the point that I'd see something in my periphery and simply not react in order to bait whatever was in my sight to continue on. No slam dunk encounter, but just some backstory for emphasis that it felt like I was living among someone else's place. This happened both days and nights, too. The real event that scared the absolute shit out of me happened while I was by myself reading American Psycho, terrible choice in hindsight. I'd stacked the side of an IKEA-like desk against a wall in a spare room when I moved in, leaned up casually but stable, to the point where it had been like that for literally 3 or 4 weeks with no disruption or slippage whatsoever, and I'd never gone back in that room for more than a second to show someone else around or something. It was the kind you pushed into place against the tabletop of the desk setup, with wooden bars in the middle like a crib, almost, probably 2.5 high and 18 inches wide. I found it when I moved in. The other parts were stacked on each other on the floor, I believe. I think the desk was missing parts. I never used it or planned to. I was just too lazy to dispose of it. As I lay reading 2 rooms over on my couch, I heard an immense and very distinct crash, like someone had tipped it over onto the hardwood floor. I went to check it out and simply found it on end inside a laundry basket. Lean upright against the wall. It was as deliberate of a placement as could be. It could not, in any way, have happened by accident and did not happen by my hand or anyone else's. The reason this was particularly terrifying is because of the relationship to the first events, that I had the nagging feeling of intrusion on someone else's domain from these peripheral visions of total mundanity. I just felt like the real owner of this home was messing with me, especially because I'd had another moment of seeing a figure walk through the kitchen not an hour prior. It got to the point that one night I said, out loud from under my covers like a child, I was 22 at the time, something to the effect of "I'm sorry, I don't mean harm, I just want to live here."